Very good. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We do have a few more people that not only are we expecting, but they're essential. For instance, Karl Hick, who's the chairman of Phoenix. So I suspect, I have been told there are one or two sort of traffic and parking issues. So there may be fair few more people to join us. So we are starting a little bit late, so forgive me for that. But a big welcome to this second workshop in the Phoenix Futures programme, which imagining the communities of the future. My name is Richard Astle. I'm going to be facilitating the event tonight. Before I start, let me just do a little bit of sort of the usual health and safety. If you could turn your mobile phones off. We're not expecting any fire drills, so if the fire alarm does go off, we'll go out through the exit there and assemble in the forecourt just outside the main entrance. The toilets are behind us again, and then just down to your left and turn left if anyone needs those. And we have programmed in a break. So hopefully everyone will be comfortable. And then after we finish, we've got some drinks and some nibbles, so we hope you will stay and join us for a little bit of networking. So as I mentioned before, this is the second of two workshops. The first one was held in Huntington on the 31st of May and was focused very much on the future of communities, housing and environment. And this second one is looking at the future of enterprise. Hello, Karl, welcome. Employment and energy. And the context in which we're holding these workshops is the fact that both Huntington District Council and Peterborough City Council are in the process of renewing, reviewing their local plans. So in other words, we're in that process of planning for the future, literally. And the question we're posing really at the moment in these workshops is how can we plan when the future is so uncertain, when there is so many objectives that we have to achieve, whether that's the desirability of good growth, whether that's carbon zero, whether that's biodiversity net gain, whether it's about creating stronger, more sustainable communities. There are so many aspects of the agenda, not least the skills and employment agenda. So we're trying to encourage us all tonight to think for the future, not about what we're doing today or what we might do tomorrow, but what does that future look like? And so we've assembled a number of speakers to come with that theme to talk within their sector about the future and what that might look like. We're going to start with a keynote address from Ross Renton, the principal of the university, and thank you, by the way, for the use of these absolutely wonderful facilities. I don't know about you, this is my first visit here, actually, and I think it's just so impressive, so thank you for that, Ross. And then Jim Plunkett-Cole will talk to us about the future of work, and in between both of those, we'll have panel sessions where we try and elaborate a little bit more and discuss more about those themes. We'll then have a break, and we'll focus on energy, and we'll bring together a panel to look at aspects of energy and innovation before we try and bring all that together, and we'll finish with Karl and talking to Karl about his ambitions for the future and the role of Phoenix in all of this. So that's really what we've got planned. We hope to engage as many of you as possible as well in that discussion, so questions, comments, disagreements, agreements. The whole idea is to try and make this a facilitated conversation rather than a series of presentations. If I can then welcome and introduce Ross Renton, who is the principal of the University of Peterborough. It's a great delight to be here. As we've said, I think so many of us have waited for this for such a long time, Ross, and to be here tonight and to be in your premises and to hear from you is a great privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the university here in Peterborough. Look, this is a phenomenal project to design and deliver a new university. Importantly, it's been done in partnership, and I want to recognise that because we've got some of the key people in the room. So we've got some of our councillors who were part of this. Peterborough City Council have been absolutely pivotal in making this happen, and also the combined authority. This is how it looked when I was appointed, which was I think it was November 21. It was a car park. I hope the council don't mind me saying it's a pretty sad car park when I came to look at it. It is looking like this now. And if you want to talk about future and investment and ambition, this is a classic example of delivering that ambition. This is the most exciting development in higher education in the UK. There is no other quite like it. And I'm saying this with evidence, and I'll give you some good reason for that as we go through my presentation. But genuinely, this is doing something really quite innovative. And it only works because of that partnership. It only works because of the vision. I also wanted to share some news with you before I get into kind of the meat of what I was going to say, which is, first of all, we've won some awards already. So we won the Odd Award, which is around this university development. One that colleagues might not be aware of, because I just got the email today, we're in the last 4 for what's called the University Alliance Award. That's a national award for the development of the university. And I'm really looking forward to sharing, hopefully, the outcome of that one. There's other 3 awards which I'm not allowed to share because they're embargoed, which we've been shortlisted for. We only opened in September, and it shows, hopefully, where we're going with it. Now, I've been asked to talk about the future of learning, and I've been given 15 minutes to do that. That's a huge challenge. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I'm going to build on something that I did 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I did a TED Talk. I had probably a few less grey hairs at that stage and probably a bit less weight, having been involved in the development of this. This TED Talk I did was over in Malvern, and interestingly, I think since doing that, it's had about 13,000 views. I've also had 2 book chapters off the back of some of the things that I've developed around this. And it's based on a thing called future studies, which I've applied in the educational sphere. So it looks at future studies is less crystal ball looking and more looking at kind of how you develop some policies going forward. So it looks at what's happened in the past and how that might happen in the future. So I'm going to go through 7 challenges I think there is around learning. The first of which is around accessibility versus consumer. So accessibility, at the moment, a lot of the learning that we have in the UK is fairly accessible. We don't charge for it. So whether that's online or, believe it or not, in our education, up to higher education. So you can access higher education and the fee itself up front is not charged to you. It's a loan. You pay back over your lifetime. So it is accessible for a lot of people. However, if you think about some of the restrictions that are starting to appear, so even down to things like books and journals, the cost of those has increased over the past few years. But also if you try and access information online, sometimes you'll find it's now behind a paywall. If you think about a young person trying to access some of that information. You remember going to a library and the newspapers being scattered out there and you can access the library newspapers or the school. All that's online now. So accessing that is going to become a real challenge. So we've got a challenge about how we make sure education and learning is accessible no matter which stage of life and no matter your background is a really key thing. And you think about somewhere like Peterborough, that is a massive challenge. We want to make sure that those who've got the ability to benefit from an education are given the tools to succeed from that. So that is one of the barriers identified. The other is learner-centred. Now, universities, schools and colleges, sometimes we're a little bit guilty of putting people into a very rigid form of education. So, for example, a university degree is often 3 years, and you don't really get a choice about what you've got to study as part of that. Going forward, learners will want to pick and choose what's right for them. They want to co-create their learning. That's a massive challenge for very rigid learning structures. And it's a huge challenge in a classroom. So if you think about a room like this, everyone's moving at different paces. Everyone's got different interests and backgrounds. And making sure that each person's learning is relevant to them will be a massive challenge going forward. But it is doable. And it is about understanding where those skill sets are, about where the assets might be. But also, when I talk about learner-centred, it's also about employers being part of that. So marrying up the employer needs with those of the learner needs. And that's, again, a massive challenge. So here, in the development of this university, we've actually put the employer at the start of the process rather than at the end of the process. So we've co-created all of our degrees, ground up with employers. So that means when we've put together the curriculum, including the assessment, the employers have been involved in that. So Test Labs, a local business, we're in with our biomedical science students assessing their final year projects. So at the end of their course in this first year, they were assessing that. That's really quite innovative. But it means for that learner, it's putting their learning at the centre of what they're doing. And I expect that to be the norm across the country. The other part for me is flexibility. So looking again at learning, we are often looking at a linear experience. And how many people in this room, when you took your education, you were on a train track, weren't you? You did your A-levels, you were then, if you went off to university, you did a set degree, perhaps a master's, and it was all pretty much in a line. That isn't going to be, in my view, the way that a lot of education will be in the future and learning in the future. I think dip in and dip out of your education and when you need it. Ensuring that your skills are expanded as you expand your knowledge and the needs of the organisations in which you exist. And already we're starting to see some of those changes coming forward. There's a number of barriers. So for the moment, we've got a rigid view of what school education looks like in terms of what is required, and the Ofsted regime is part of that. But also even in higher education, our funding is based often in a very rigid view of what higher education looks like. And also the way that we measure quality. So the outcomes, we're expecting people to be get a job at the end of what they're doing. And I think often we'll be looking at people already having a job and developing their education through that employment. And there's some, I think, encouraging things coming forward which will support that. So I think called the lifelong loan entitlement. It really trips off the tongue as a name. You can tell policy people sat around and came up with something that's catchy. But what this will allow is people to have bite-sized education at any stage of life. They have an allowance to pull off of. And I'm really supportive of this. The current government has come up with this policy. I think this really makes sense for a modern country who wants to see education at every step of the way. The other element which has been in the news quite a bit is around technology and how technology will influence learning. So for many of you, you would have be aware of the developments around artificial intelligence. A lot of what's being talked about, I'm afraid, isn't terribly new. So ChatGPT is quite a good gimmick on that, but we've already been using quite a bit of technology within education. And in fact, there is already the ability to set examinations, set coursework, and mark it without a human being involved in any of that process. Whether that's the right thing is for us to decide, the kind of ethics around developing that. But some institutions in Australia, for example, were designing their courses online using the AI technology and then assessing it at the end of that process. For me, I think it's where it really adds value in terms of technology is not being leading what we do, not being the thing that we sell our learning upon, but supporting our learning. So a good example of that is where technology allows you to be in an immersive environment. You're able to make the mistakes in those environments before you go into the real life experience. So for example, in the campus here, we're developing an extended reality facility. I don't know if anyone ever looks at or has watched Star Trek, if you want to admit to being a Trekkie. There's a thing called a holodeck where you go into and you can be in any environment. We're developing that here on this campus. It means we can put people into environments which are often aren't safe. So if you're working on, let's say, high-pressure hydrogen development, we can put them into those environments, make some of those mistakes, go into a hospital environment, perhaps have some of the more tragic things happen there, but learn from that before you go into the real environment dealing with people. So technology is supporting your learning, but not leading it. And I think that will be really key. And we've seen that post-pandemic in education. Students wanting to be back on into the classroom, to be among other people. We're social animals, and how we make sure our learning is supported is through each other. So in the design of this facility, for example, you'll find that our classrooms are smaller. We don't have big lecture theatres. We want people to collaborate, to work together, to be in those scenarios, which are real life on that. So technology enabled. And some good examples of that in some of the images here, where technology augments, improves, supports, but it doesn't replace that interaction. You cannot replace a good teacher in the classroom. You can't replace someone sharing their experience as an apprentice, someone who's learned for years about the skill sets you need to share that. You cannot replace that with technology alone. The other one, which follows on actually on from the artificial intelligence point, is about being creative and innovative. So a really nice quote that came forward from Jack Ma. I don't know if people have came across Jack Ma. Set up the website Alibaba, massive website. He's a multi-billionaire from it. But he's been really realistic about the use of technology. And he was saying it can't create, it can't innovate, and actually it can't love. It loses the things that humans can do. If we want our learning to really be powerful, you need to think about the things where machines can't do it. So creativity is really important, no matter which area you work in. Thinking differently, sometimes challenging the norms. And this is an issue you'll find in some Asian countries, for example. So if you look at China, the Confucius way of learning is often someone standing in front of you, you copy that down, and that is the master, is the tutor. If I'm in a room, I want students to be challenging us, to be saying, kind of, I don't agree with you, that's not right. That debate and that learning through challenge is really important. And we want that in our hospitals. We want people who are standing around, not just saying the consultant is right, but saying, I don't agree with that. That needs to be there. So that creativity and innovation is really key in the learning. And again, cannot be replaced by technology alone. The other part, which if you speak to particularly young people, what they're looking for from their learning is societal change. So if you meet with, for example, our youth council that's here in Peterborough, our youth MP, who's fantastic, you speak to them, their values about what they're looking for through their learning is really interesting. So one element that comes across is around environmental impact. It comes in every conversation I have with our younger students. It came when I met with the Youth Council here. And what they're looking for is not for standalone sustainability courses per se. They want to see it across their learning, what impact they're having, where that innovation might be around there. What impact are they having in other people? And if you look at the kind of generational research around the new generations coming through, they're less bothered about wealth and more about experiential. What can they have an impact on others? I really encourage you to have a look at some of the research that's came out around the next generation coming through and what they value compared to perhaps what we value around it. So that societal change in their learning will be really important. The things they learn, how can they apply that to make a difference for others? I find that quite encouraging, hearing that from young people. The other part, which I'm going to depress you, I'm afraid, is lifelong. And the reason it will depress you is those who were born in 2020. If you were a woman, you're more likely to live to 90. If you're a man, 87.7, I think it is, the current research says. They will be working into their 70s, perhaps their 80s. They're going to need to continually change the skills. I don't know about you, when I get a new phone, it takes me a little bit longer each time to learn some of the things on it. When I get a new television, it takes me a bit longer to work out how to get access to particular things. It's not good enough. Things will continue to rapidly change. And we need to give people the tools, the skills to navigate that change that comes forward. Whether it be about artificial intelligence, about environmental changes, how can we make sure that people's skills are there for them? So, for example, if you're in a very traditional engineering environment, how do we support them to change their skills around hydrogen distribution, around battery technology? How do we make sure that those people aren't left behind? So making sure that the learning is not just seen as something for the young, but it's seen every stage of your life. We build it into our culture. And a huge challenge around that will be getting employers to value that. So often, for example, now where there is fairly high employment, getting employers to think about making space for the staff to train, to have a talent pipeline going through to the future is a big challenge for them. But I encourage them to do it, because if we don't, we'll fall behind as a country. We'll fall behind in some of those key skill sets. So lifelong will be really important. And for that, you need to be ambitious. And my kind of final point is All of these things are really important, but they don't replace really good teaching and learning. So I encourage us as a city and as a region to be ambitious around what learning looks like. It takes place, yes, in buildings and the development of a university, but it takes place in the workplace. It happens at home, and we need to make sure that we give people the tools and the ability to really maximise, supercharge their ability around that. So I kind of set that challenge around us. We all have a responsibility, no matter what we're doing. And I think we've got the ingredients here in this city. We've got high quality college. We've got a high quality university here. We've got a council who wants to see real change taking place. And I think we've got employers that have got a vision to support that. So I encourage you to support that future of learning here in Peterborough. Thank you.
Ross, do you want to sit at the panel here? Yeah, and can I ask Mark and Laura to come and join me, please? Well, thank you so much, Ross. That was absolutely spot on in terms of you were absolutely to time, so what an example to set, but also utterly focused on the future, and that's really what we're all here to talk about. So thank you so much for setting that tone. I was certainly really excited to hear some of the things you were talking about. If anybody wants to sit down, there are some more chairs, please. There's a table just round the corner, which is completely empty, so you've got plenty of space. Thank you. Great. What we wanted to talk about then was really just to reflect a little bit on that. And I'm delighted to introduce Mark Woods, who's the Chief Executive of Meridian Trust, and he can say a little bit more about himself and his organisation. And Laura, is it Guymer? Guymer, who's from the Combined Authority, the Strategic Skills Lead there. And obviously we know Ross already. Really just to have that discussion a little bit about some of the themes that were coming out. And I would encourage you as well to raise your hands and ask any questions or make any comments, or if you're unfortunate, I may even turn to you because I think you may have something to say and ask you just what that might be. If you do have a question, we do have roving mics. Beth and Faye, could you arrange for those to be taken round as we need them? But I wondered if I could start perhaps with you, Mark, if that's okay. I've heard there really from Ross about the future of learning at perhaps a sort of a university level, higher education. Sounded really exciting. How does that apply to the future of education at the schools level? I mean, there were some things there about flexibility. I thought your pupils are going to love that. Can we apply some of those things? How does it look from where you're sitting?
Confusing is probably the fairest way to describe it. Meridian Trust is a trust of 30 academies across the 6 local authorities. Our young people that we work with and beyond young people start from early years, so they make their way through from early years education. And when you go in there, I'm a secondary specialist by trade. I walk in and watch 3 and 4 year olds learning, and some of this, it seems an awfully long way away from that because the stuff that they're learning is very, very different. And then you have your early primary years, and then they start making their way through into secondary, and you start to watch that agency change. Where in fact, strangely, you watch quite a lot of agency in EYFS, then you watch that disappear, and then it seems to come back when they get older. And that's a really interesting learning journey about when you can dip in and dip out. I regularly have to encourage, particularly teenage boys, not to dip out. And they can't control what learning they're going to do because they have these GCSEs and A-levels, which are really rather rigid. If you haven't done exactly what it says inside there, you're not going to achieve, and you're not going to go on to be able to choose what you want to be able to do next. So it's a significant challenge that sits inside there for us about how that works. Then we do also work with ITT, so initial teacher training students, through into MPQs and beyond, and then you start to talk about a whole different way of learning. But there's something about making sure that people have that kind of equity and that accessibility to be able to do it that I think is really tricky. Because one of the things we watched during COVID, unsurprisingly, was when children were at home, the progress they made was almost directly related to the affluence of their parents and their opportunities to be able to support. And I watch a lot of what goes on now and wonder about what that will manage to achieve in our society if we're not super careful.
Thanks, Mark. And Laura, perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourself and what you do, and then really pose the question for you. You know, there's quite a lot of stuff in what Ross was saying about that interconnectivity with employers, and it's fascinating to hear about employers actually almost setting the curriculum, and I might come back to you on that as well, Mark, because it'd be fascinating to hear about that in a schools environment. But how, Laura, do you go about predicting, you know, what skills we need for the future, and then how do you work with employers to do that? What's the Combined Authority's plan for that? And given that there's so much uncertainty, it sounds like a difficult task.
Yeah, thank you and good afternoon all. So I work within the Combined Authority, specifically within the skills team, and we're continuously looking at what skills are needed for the region, and we do that through looking at both national and regional trends. We look at policy, central government policy that's coming on. We know as a region we need strong technical skills. We know for our economy to be successful, we need to ensure that our people have the skills to do those jobs. We have our growth sectors within the area, so we've got a clear focus around digital and artificial intelligence, agritech, advanced manufacturing and life sciences. We know those are the sectors where the core jobs are going to be found within our area. It doesn't mean we don't look into our other foundational sectors, but we have a big focus in there. And I think, you know, as any area probably has, green skills and digital artificial intelligence are massive focuses of what we are going to be looking at from a skills point over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years. But also from a regional point, we focus on levelling up. We focus on the skill sets and the level of skills that we have within the region and what we can do to make sure that the whole region is prosperous and there's equitable jobs for all at all levels. In terms of being a combined authority, we have a certain autonomy around our adult education budget. So we're trying to make sure we invest that in the areas that need it. We might have uplifts available so people can access a skills escalator, so they can start with developing those lower level skills and be moving into our levels 3s, 4s, 5s and beyond. University forms a big part of that levelling up piece that we've got going on at the moment. And I think really just to touch upon something Ross was saying earlier, a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at what was probably once termed soft skills, but they're those skills that are transferable. They're those skills that we take with us throughout our careers, and recognising we have an ageing workforce, recognising that people may change jobs up to 15 times in their working lives, and they're the skills that can't be replaced by technology. They are things like our critical thinking skills, they are emotional intelligence, they're leadership, management, communications. They're all of those skills that we start to build throughout our primary, secondary education and take with us throughout our career. So we have a real focus around that.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask the audience for some questions and comments in a second, but Mark, maybe I could come back to you on that question I sort of touched upon. You know, from what we're hearing from Laura and Ross, huge interaction with employers there. Could you see a future where employers are working with you to design courses for school children? Is that a stretch too far?
No. I think the dangerous thing is that we've gone around that loop a few times. I was just noting earlier, we had specialist schools, if people remember them, a few years ago, where we were working with employers, and some of them were hugely successful, and then it kind of all died, and we did a huge amount of work. We're about diplomas, and that disappeared, and we're now starting on T-levels, and it feels like we're going round in a loop and we never actually managed to find how we're going to do this sustainably. Well, during our work, we've had fantastic relationships with employers, but unfortunately they don't go beyond person-dependent pieces. Usually it's someone within the school who has an interest and knows someone in the local workforce. They make some kind of combination, it lasts for 5 or 6 years, and then it dissipates, and we go around in another loop, somewhat as well driven by, as Ross was referring to, the push-pull factors of league tables and Ofsted. I don't think necessarily work towards the agenda that you're describing, and I think many of us are describing. I think that's a real shame. The other piece, I'd go back to your point around those soft skills. We've never really worked out a way of measuring them. I can remember having, I think it was called a record of achievement for anybody else who's of the same age. You know, no use. I've still got it at home if anybody wants to read for some smiles, but it's never actually been any use to me. And I did take it to a couple of places when I was going through, and when I tried to present it, people said, "What's that? What's its purpose?" And you stop bothering. So I think we've got to work out how we do it strategically.
Is that the same about the point that Ross made about societal change? How do we embed that? I mean, Laura, can we embed that in the skills agenda? Can we talk that through with employers? Is that something they would recognise?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, dependent on size of employers, dependent on age of employers and where they are within their own journey, there is so much that we see coming through that's perhaps from a social value piece that's playing into the investment they're making within skills. And, you know, I think it goes to the point you made earlier. The way in which we buy skills now is totally different. The way in which we encourage people to the workforce is completely different. We're in a different place to what we were 10, 20 years ago. And I do think that societal piece plays a massive part of how employers attract and retain, and skills is a part of that.
Excellent, thank you. Nigel, I think you had a question? Yeah, so can we just open it up to questions? Someone let Nigel have a microphone? Have we got one handy? Faye, could you just come and help with the microphones, please? Do you want to introduce yourself and then ask your question? Thank you.
Is it on?
It is?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so thank you, and thanks, Karl and Phoenix, for putting today on. I think to have some useful conversations this evening. An opinion and a double-edged question. Laura, I think you're absolutely right. There must be a set of inherent skills and behaviours probably that we should all exhibit to be successful in the workplace or successful in life. How we articulate those, I don't know, but you'll be better placed than I am. So I see the behaviour different from a skill, because the skill's about the employment, the behaviour's about you as a human being, your ability to get on in that sense. But also I was struck by your point on innovation, and surely the challenge, speaking as somebody with 2 young grandkids, is how on earth do you design for a curriculum or an education process for careers and jobs and opportunities that we don't even conceive yet? Your mobile phone, your smart TV, nobody ever thought of those, never mind how you service them and build them. So how do you future-proof education or have education agile enough to deal with that societal change or technology change? And then the second part of that is whatever you're training people and educating people to become, for those of us involved in the development sector and putting places on the ground you can do all this stuff, how on earth do we design good future places that can actually deliver the employment aspirations and the living aspirations that those well-educated people will actually have? So that's the 2 questions is, how can we predict the future from education, and how can we predict the physical future for places that allow that to happen? Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Ross, do you want to have a first stab at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a first stab at it, and then we'll see. Colleagues can kind of come up with better answers than me, hopefully. I think the first one is you can't predict the future. I mean, that was a crystal ball point I made, is there is a whole world of studies on future studies. Banks use it. I've used it, the same methodology around education. What I would say is some of it isn't about predicting the future, but ensuring people have got themselves that flexibility and ability to learn. And kind of we in universities have been saying this for a long while. We're not necessarily teaching people just the skill we're giving them in the classroom on, let's say if it's midwifery, delivering babies. We have to teach them to be adaptable, to change those skill sets, to understand why they're doing some of these things. And some of the advances in medical education moved away from just showing you the technique and showing you kind of what the technique was about and how it might develop and change over the next few years. So I think some of it is giving people the skills to navigate some of it. I call it a curating ability. How do you curate all the information you have? It's really confusing trying to find kind of decent information out there. We say there's lots of knowledge available. The internet allows you to find huge amounts of information. How do you know it's accurate? How do you know what you're reading has got fidelity to it? So giving people those skills around that. And that's actually quite traditional. I mean, any historians in the room will know about some of that, the triangulation ability that you have to apply to that. And I think these things are really key building blocks. But you're right, it's not easy. A little bit about creating the right places in spaces. I think, Peterborough could be a really good example of saying this is where we specialise as a city. This is how we will support. So having a really clear skills strategy where actually all of the players are working together. So at every single stage, schools, colleges, university, employers, and the third sector, working in partnership to develop what we see as being the future in this city. I think that's really exciting. I've not seen that done that well elsewhere in the country, and I think we've got an opportunity. I feel that green skills is part of that. I know the college has got aspirations around there. I know the city has got aspirations as well. We could really be well placed given where we sit. So some of that is about us being ambitious around being clear about what we want to try and achieve.
Thanks, Ross. Laura, do you want to take that and then come back to Mark?
Yeah, I think there's also a piece around having agility within the skills system, because as Ross was saying, we can't predict the future, and if we look at what COVID did. You know, very quickly our educational institutes had to turn on their feet in terms of how things were taught. It's had a huge impact on jobs and the jobs that are going to be in existence. I think we're quite fortunate in the sense of our skill system within the area is agile and it does respond to market needs. And I think it's really important that we always have that at the forefront of what we're doing. Quite often our teachers are preparing children for jobs that don't exist. And they accept that, our teachers accept that. And I think from a combined authority point, one of the things we encourage with the providers we work for is to be forward-looking and to be able to respond to market needs.
Thank you. Mark, any thoughts from you on?
I pick up on something we talked about previously at the former session. There's something about communities and schools and about civic trusts and the way in which we can involve ourselves in the way that young people's experience works all the way through. And I think that's everybody working together collaboratively. Certainly Northstowe, some of you will be familiar with the education campus at the heart of Northstowe. That's been a fascinating journey in terms of the aspirations. And I was reading this week how it's been described as a dormitory place again. It wasn't meant to be anything like Cambourne, and yet it has become just like Cambourne. There aren't any shops, there doesn't have the leisure centre yet, and we need to work out how we can manage those things, because I think they make them aspirational places for people to live. A colleague the other day, when we were having a similar discussion, he was talking about they think that we've got to be able to ask better questions. That's the key skill that we need to be providing young people with. I quite often do end of term things. One of the ones I use a lot is Who Moved My Cheese, the book. And I say all young people, if we can teach them how to deal with change and failure, then we've prepared them for life. And I don't mean that to sound horrible, but they are the best things that we can teach them to do. Not many parents appreciate when you're trying to explain that their child's just failed, that this is a very valuable experience for them. They normally want you to avoid them failing. And the older they get, the harder that gets when it comes around to key qualifications. The last thing, and I've just always put this in, our workforce is key. And actually it's really difficult to get people into education at the moment. And that's a massive problem. Because if we don't have the right people in education, then you're not going to get the right people into the workforce. And we have that real push-pull challenge. One of our current ones is around flexibility of work. I'm ever so sorry, most people want their children in school between certain hours of the day and they want the same teacher there 5 days a week. That's what we all demand, but that's not what we want as a workforce now. And we're facing that massively on a day-to-day challenge as we work. And I'm not sure what the answer is, and I don't think we're going to solve it just here. But for me, that's a big problem we need to reconcile.
So that actually comes on to the future of work, which is something we're going to be talking about later. Karl, you had a question. Could we get a microphone to Karl, please? And then Tom Bingham, I think you've got a question after that. In fact, let's take both questions and then we can farm them out between us. Thank you.
Hello, it's Karl Hick. I'm the chairman of Phoenix. One of the things that would be really useful for the panel there's two things. One is the balance of education between kind of university and academia, and then looking at practical skill sets. So people going through the education system have a choice of both, but they don't feel disadvantaged because they haven't got letters after their name in the latter, but they are probably as important, and in my view, probably more important. And how do we address that as we go through a modern society where not everyone wants to go to university anymore? And one of the things that I was involved with, and I'm not quite sure it's been as successful as I thought it might be, but when I was one of the instigators of the UTC here in Peterborough, I was passionate about trying to bring the skill sets from a practical point of view into play that much more. So it wasn't all about everyone needing kind of university standards. So that's number one. The second one, I look at a lot of people that are early retired, and given Ross's view that the average age might be 87 and 90, we have an unbelievable key population of people who are at 60 who are probably not back in the workforce, but they've probably got another 10 or 15 years to reskill and really, really add value. Now, the courses are not really there, in my view, but there's such a massive resource that we have here in Peterborough where people can reskill and help employers to be able to do things. So there's two things there that I would quite like to address.
Thank you, Karl. Let's take those two. And Tom, have you got a question you'd like to add? I think the microphone's on its way back to you, and then I'll pass them around the panel there.
Thanks, Richard. Ross, I was struck by your talk, and the areas you talked about were a lot around culture of learning. One of the things that seems to be growing and might be a threat to the future of learning, I'd be interested in your views, or all your views, is the growing intolerance to views that you don't necessarily agree with, and the sort of instant outrage that seems to be, I don't know, it could be the media getting it wrong, or maybe it's true, I don't know, but it seems to be a growing intolerance to debating views that you deem unacceptable, or someone deems unacceptable, and is that a threat to the future of learning, and what can we do about it?
Lovely. Thanks, Tom. Okay, well, let's start perhaps with that question about the balance between academia and technical. It's been very much in the news recently, and I wonder perhaps I could start with you on that one, Laura. Do you have any thoughts on that, and how are you planning for that and the balance between the two?
So I think that the technical education reforms that started probably back in 2016, I think we're really seeing coming to fruition now. I think there's the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education have done a huge amount of work into ensuring that the employer's voice has been at the heart of our technical education standards, whether that be apprenticeships or T-levels that have been developed. And I think there's been a lot of work that's happened in terms of the workplace adopting and working within apprenticeships. There's also been a big shift within the education system within our schools as to how young people are informed and given information, advice and guidance around apprenticeships. January this year saw the implementation of the provider access legislation, which means every young person must have 6 interactions with providers of apprenticeships or technical education by the time they leave school in year 13 or the equivalent of year 13. So I think we're moving in the right direction. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think we're getting to a place where there is parity. I think we are getting to a place where employers adopting apprenticeships for their incumbent workforce, they are taking people on that lifelong learning journey. So it's becoming quite clear, I think, when you enter the workplace, what perhaps that learning journey or that occupational pathway looks like. It's not perfect, and there's a long time, it's a cultural change piece that we're going to, but I think we are making moves in the right direction. I also think that, it's perhaps changing the language and changing the narrative. I don't believe it's university or, I think it can be technical education and, we've got some great degree apprenticeships that are being run, and it's a really viable alternative for a lot of young people now than purely going down that academic route. So I suppose a long way around answering is we're not there, but we are on the right trajectory, and the options are now there, and the products to service the market are, are being taken on by the marketplace.
And Ross, does this come back to the two things you talked about, were learner-centred co-creation and the sort of flexible dip in, dip out? Does Karl's question sort of talk to that?
Yeah, there's a bit of it. I mean, interestingly, this isn't just a UK issue. So I'm running a chapter just now on the future of technical education and looking at a lens beyond higher education. So I was speaking to an academic in Germany. So Germany is known for its technical education. It's got a culture. The system's been built up that way. There's a parity of esteem as well between those, for example, if you're an engineer, it's seen equally as someone who's a doctor, a medical doctor. That isn't the case necessarily in the UK. But what I would say is they're kind of looking at the same issues at all levels. I think for us, it's about what do we mean by technical education and at what stages the people are developing their skills. I'm a big advocate of not saying people are going just to university. I think there's multiple options for you to develop your learning. If we get this development of the university here right, then a number of those students will never step foot onto the campus or only do it occasionally. What they will be doing is learning in the workplace, and it won't necessarily be a traditional full degree. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's taking the benefits of having higher theoretical learning and applying it in that technical sense. So a good example is if someone is developing battery technology, they will need to know some of that theory and why it's dangerous and applying it in different ways. But at the same time, they need the technical skills to build the thing and put it in place. So it's about combining the two. And I think we've got the ability here to do some of that as a city. But I wouldn't get too tied up in trying to split academia in technical education. I think they probably are coming together in quite a healthy way. Don't get me wrong, there'll still be those who want to go down a theoretical route. Philosophers will always exist. But at the same time, we want to make sure that people are able to build those technical skills as they go through their career.
Brilliant. And Mark, I wondered if perhaps we could ask you to sort of focus on the second part of Karl's question. He specifically, of course, referenced the Greater Peterborough Universal Technical College, which is a Meridian Trust, part of the Trust, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's somewhat to do with whether we articulate as well in this country to people the intention of change. So I think UTC's an absolutely classic example of Lord Baker's vision, and there's real sense inside there, but it never translated in so many places. That's why so many have closed. Students don't tend to like the idea of changing midway through their secondary education. It's not something that happens in this country. So what actually happened, and I know the one here very well, as Richard says, actually a number of other schools used it as a place to encourage people to go to if you weren't getting on in your current school. Why don't you go there? It wasn't conceived, unfortunately, quite the way that I think Karl saw it. It was very much around come here to do engineering and A-levels. It wasn't that practical subject piece, which it could and should have been to some extent, because I think, and hopefully Rachel and I talk about it an awful lot. Rachel is one of our sponsors and our next door neighbour at the college. We're all trying to work out what we do with T-levels with the bonfire of the BTECs. To my mind, there's a whole part of our culture at this time, our young people, there's no qualifications for them that we can see coming forward. We're aiming for this part. There's not a lot then that sits underneath it. So if you're not the ones who are passing particular GCSEs, there's nothing really there for you. And I think we need to work out how we can manage that far better, and that does mean valuing technical education in all sorts of different varieties through to that old-fashioned kind of vocational piece, because there are skills. I'm an English teacher, I can write you a lovely essay. I couldn't build you a wall if you told me where to start and gave me instructions. And I think we don't value those kind of skills in this country anywhere like we should, and they're damn sure not in our league tables. And I think that's a massive issue that we need to work out. I think beyond that, I take the point about re-engaging older people. I think that's a massive challenge for us, and I think that's a real shame because I'd love to get them back in our workforce straight away. And I'll pick up on the clickbait question. It's dreadful at the moment. Newspapers, they can pick up on a story, and you'll have seen one just recently that ends in a massive Ofsted inspection from a tiny piece of social media that's been filmed by a child. I don't think there's a lot of responsibility for the reporting that goes on. I think what people are doing is just trying to drive advertising regardless of the damage that it might do. So if you see stories like that, don't click on them because then they'll stop running them.
Brilliant, thanks Mark. So I've just got a couple of minutes left of this session, so I wondered if perhaps I could ask Ross, do you want to have a try at Tom's question there? I mean, are we closing down sort of discussion and debate? And that's obviously a big barrier to the ambition you talked about if we are. You talked about wanting to be challenged.
Yeah, it's a problem. Is it a problem? I'm not sure it's a problem, but I'll give you my view, if that helps. And it is my personal view, which is I want to see debate, challenge. I want to hear views I disagree with. I want to argue with those views, dismantle them, and hopefully win the argument, but it won't always be the case because that's background as a university person. But we need to have that kind of challenge. It goes back to a bit, AI is not going to debate itself particularly well. We're not going to create new ideas if we aren't listening to each other. But there is an extreme of both. You can have an extreme of both views, and it's how you mute that. How do you deal with where there's extremities of views? And I think that's where the big challenge is. We need to do it in a compassionate, responsible way of having those debates. I think there was a great survey done about universities. There was news about universities banning speakers. I think there was really tiny examples of that. I mean, you looked at the kind of speakers that universities bring in. Many would find them quite objectionable, but actually it does start to provide challenge. It means people think differently. It means people are able to challenge each other. And you'll hear from me, I have a desire here, whether you're studying engineering or health or data science, I want you to hear different views on that because that'll help you develop your knowledge. It makes you are better equipped. And I remember as a student who grew up in a scheme outside Glasgow, I got a lot of my skills coming from joining in debates, arguing with people, trying to find my way, getting it wrong sometimes, and that's a healthy thing to have. So I would encourage it. I encourage it in our students. I know in schools it's something that we're trying to encourage. We just need to make sure that we're putting some elements of responsibility around that so we don't enter into culture wars around these kind of things, for example.
Mark, quickly, any thoughts on that from the school perspective?
Echo absolutely everything that you said there around not being drawn into those items, managing to provide things in safe places. And you picked up on the point earlier on about how people develop at different rates, and that's massively complicated. In a secondary school of 240 young people at year 10, they're not year 10s, they're 240 young people. And there are some I would give massively complicated things to and encourage them to engage. Others I'd be terrified. Some of our schools are SEND schools, and we haven't mentioned that and inclusivity at all. There's a massive part of our population where we need to think about how we can serve them the best way that we can. The other major fear I have around AI is algorithms. We saw what happened when we let them mark children's work during COVID. You ended up with the ridiculous things being decided upon. I've heard the tales of police in the north, I think it was, who were determining, and they were forgoing people who came from affluent areas, parking tickets, etc., speeding fines, but they weren't from other areas because they were more likely to reoffend. I think we need to be super careful about when we start trusting machines to be using algorithms to make decisions on our behalf, because I think it'll end up being reductionist, and that worries me about how that will work inside our schools.
Lovely. Thanks, Mark and Laura. Any final remarks from you before we finish?
I don't think I do. I think you've both covered it all.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our panel. I was just struck, really, I think I would summarise the whole thing by Ross's little point there, that there will always be philosophers. So let's sort of take that one away with us as part of that debate. But thank you very much indeed to our panel. Thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Great stuff. So we're going to move on to our next session. That was the future of skills and education. So we're now going to be looking at the future of work. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Jim Plunkett-Cole. Has he gone? I'm sure he's here somewhere. Was he there a minute ago? Sorry, yeah. He's there, sorry. Who is a future of work champion, director at Smart Growth Analytics, and has recently completed and is about to publish some really intriguing research on the revolution that is the workplace at the moment. So, Jim, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for being a bit late there. I've got a broken finger from... I got in the way of two dogs fighting. I don't recommend you ever do that. One of them was my dog, incidentally. I think, as Ross said, we can't really predict the future. Saying that, I'm going to try and give a few generics about the future of work. This isn't going to cover every job in the economy. You simply can't do that. But I think it covers some of the generic trends and issues that are probably affecting the lion's share of jobs in the economy. I'm just going to go through some of the key drivers, key characteristics, take a look at Huntingtonshire and Peterborough and how they apply there, look at the implications for local economic development and planning, and offer up some final conclusions. And I'll keep an eye on the clock there. So I'm going to talk a bit about the creative and knowledge-based industries. These are a definition. They are it's knowledge-based services and knowledge-based production, and that includes, in summary, ICT, media, R&D, business services, higher education, oil and gas, electricity production, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, electronics, machinery, and automotive. It also includes various aspects of artistic creation. In the UK, this is 7 million jobs. It's only about 35% of total UK employment. But they account for 68% of the UK's total tradable sectors. Those are the sectors that you find on employment land and in business parks and on industrial estates. So whilst they only account for 35% of UK total employment, they've actually got 48% of total GVA. That's gross value added output. That's half of everything that is produced in this country done with only just over 1/3 of its employment. They're also important because they account for the UK's tradable sectors, which they drive, account for 100% of our exports by definition. And they accounted for 86% of UK growth between 2004 to 2021. 86%, that's pretty much just about all growth from 2004 onwards. So the tradable sector drives the UK economy. The creative knowledge-based industries drives the tradable sector. So it's the creative knowledge-based industries, in turn, which are pretty much driving the UK economy, if that makes sense. Moving on to professional workers, over half of the workers in the UK is now a professional. It didn't used to be that, but now 52% of everyone who works in this country is a professional. That happened where it became the majority only in the last couple of years. I'll show you that a bit more in a minute. That now means there's 15 million professionals in the UK, 4/5, and they account for 4/5 of all of the UK's higher skilled workers. They've got a salary performance of 132%, the national average, and they account for 73% of the UK's entire employee salary bill. 80% of the UK's 6 million, this is higher skilled workers, are 56% of UK total employment. As I say, professionals are 52%. 80% of the UK's 6 million additional workers from 2004 up until the present were professional. So 86% were creative and knowledge-based industries, and 80% of the UK's additional 6 million workers were professional. And they are expected to account, employment projections suggest that they will account for about 70% of the UK's projected employment growth to 2050. So here we have higher skilled workers drive the UK economy, professionals drive higher skilled workers, so you can therefore see the professionals are also driving the UK economy. Does it keep clicking back, or am I going mad? This is how those trends. So this goes back to 2004. So you can see how they gradually rose from about 1/3 of workers in 2004 to 52% of, well, this is just pre-pandemic. You can see that they kind of flattened out at the pandemic period. But since the pandemic, their stocks continue to rise again, and they are now 52%. Unfortunately, you can't put on the 2023 onto that chart because the Office for National Statistics changed the definitions of the standard occupational classifications which we use to derive these statistics, which isn't particularly useful. So here you have got the trend analysis. Quick poll of the audience. Who worked at home before the pandemic? Predominantly 3 days a week or more at home before the pandemic. Before. Yeah, okay. Who worked at home during the pandemic? Yeah, super. And who worked at home? Who works at home now? Still? Wow. Okay. That pretty much follows the statistics that I'm about to tell you. In that case, that's good to know that you haven't all gone back to work, because otherwise I might as well throw this away. Anyway, in 1998, 1 in 10 of all workers was a home worker, and that rose to 1 in 7 in 2019. Then the pandemic came along, and the rate of home working almost quadrupled overnight. It went up to 43%. And then that settled in the first quarter of Q1 when Boris announced the return to work. You might recall that. That settled back down to 31%, and it pretty much hasn't shifted since. In other words, so many of those people that were suddenly instigated and starting to work at home, they've stayed at home and they haven't gone back. And there's very good reasons, which I'll look into in a minute. So we now have a home working rate, which is double the pre-pandemic home working rate. That's 5.3 million workers overnight working from home, and they've not gone back. And pretty much they are all professional workers. That's 16% of all UK workers are a professional, which pretty much is 1 in 6 of all workers in this country is a professional person working from home now. That was definitely not the same before the pandemic. This is the trend that, I hope you can see that. This is the trend that happened. You can kind of see when the pandemic came along, if that makes sense. I think this goes back to about 1998. Then you can see the pandemic came along and it went up to 43. That's pretty much the maximum that you could get. I mean, everyone who could work from home was pretty much working from home at that point. So it kind of tells us that's probably around the maximum at the way the economy is structured at the moment that would work from home. And then it's sort of settled back down, but nothing going back to what it was before. And this is some of the reasons why I don't think that people have gone back to work. It's the legacy of the pandemic. The increasing cost of going to work. We've seen the transport disruption that we've had quite recently. My train was delayed today, for example. I'm sure everyone else has got similar experiences. It just makes it more and more difficult to get to work. People and businesses have got an ongoing desire to reduce their carbon footprint. We all felt the quality of life improvements that we had from that additional flexibility from working from home. There's an ongoing rise in the proportion of jobs which are able to work from home, which is also driving that. And there's been a general rise in formal and informal co-working opportunities, which combine all of those things together has led to an ongoing cultural shift in the location of work in the UK. And I predict that in the future, working from home, in the near future up to the next sort of 2030, it's probably going to be about 35 to 40% of all workers. Some of the further drivers are the quality of life and increased social responsibility that businesses are now doing. And that ties in with one bit further down, which is how businesses are learning to deal with skill shortages that we've got in the UK, which aren't going to be going away anytime soon. And so businesses and employers have got to be a bit more tolerant of that workforce flexibility and working from home. We've got greater environmental responsibilities, as I say. We've got the ageing population, the ageing workforce that was mentioned just now. And we've got artificial intelligence, which has also been mentioned, and as I said before, the growth of local co-working opportunities. And if you bring all of those together, I think you get some characteristics of the future of work which are pretty interesting. But pretty much those characteristics suggest that the future of work is going to conform far more to sustainable development than has ever happened in the past. So I see some of the generic characteristics as being local, remote, in the home, for informal and informal co-working settings such as coffee shops and cafes, even pubs, community-driven, far more social, flexible, inclusive, far more of what we experienced during the pandemic, professional, creative, collaborative, lower cost, higher skilled, higher value added, and higher paid. And then I come on to the concept of hidden business parks, which I'll do in a minute, but this is tribrid working, where does anyone here follow the tribrid model of working? Do you work in anyone here work in local co-working centres at all? Have you got any locally? Okay. Oh, we have got some locally then. Oh, good. I was hoping that... It was what, sorry? Oh, excellent. Super. Right. I'm your biggest fan in that case. Yeah. So people who work in local co-working centres near where they live because they want to have that community and social interaction that they had from work. Younger people quite often meet their future partner at work, so they don't want to work at home exclusively. But then again, they don't want to be going into the central workplace all of the time either. People want to have flexibility and balance, and that's very good for networking, it's very good for collaboration, and it's very good for the business model of local co-working centres as well. And I like to think of myself as a tribrid worker. There aren't many of us in this room, but there's a few that I've done at other presentations, that's for sure. So we've got something called, what I call hidden business parks. We have, looking at this local area, which I took a look at, the census came out in 2021, which wasn't a good time to do a census to ask people when they're working at home, when they had to work at home anyway. However, as I say, a lot of them haven't gone back. And during the census, this area of Peterborough had the highest volume and proportion of home workers as a percentage of all workers. Does anyone know where it is or care to... someone say yeah? What's it called? Oh. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. You lost me there. It's a part of Peterborough that I thought someone might know. That's right next to the East of England Showground. Oh, it's not operational anymore then?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Oh, it is?
Long story.
Okay. I think it's called Orton Brimballs. Does that figure? Yeah, okay. All right, so Google hasn't let me down in that case. Anyway, yeah, it's called Dunblane Drive. 48% of everyone who works in that area is a professional person, works from home, and almost all of them are professional people. This is what I call, so it's this part here. that middle section there is the main area. These are called output areas that were in the census, and they are groups of about 130 households. I mean, it's pretty small. This is what I call street map voyeurism. You can pretty much tell that in those houses, half of all people are working from home. You can pretty much tell what they're doing, by way of work, that is, not the other sort of stuff. Google's obviously a very powerful tool if you do my job. This is the so implications for traditional workspace. I think traditional workspace probably was at a high point in 2019. I don't personally think it will ever go back to those levels again in the UK. No matter what Jacob Rees-Mogg wanted, or Boris wanted, or whoever wanted at the time, I don't ever see them going back to those levels again. Businesses have restructured their work practices since the pandemic. Most businesses certainly have. There's a few businesses, which are the exception, which are trying to drag their employees back into the workplace, but they are not the majority. They are very much the minority, even if they have got big names like Dyson and so on. Some purpose is going to be repurposed for other uses. In Oxfordshire, there was some being repurposed for lab space, because there's a lack of lab space in Oxfordshire. Affordable housing, extra care facilities, those are things quite popular. Or even co-working spaces where everybody can go in. Something that I've been trying to encourage Cornwall Council to do is to get all of this, is to open up local co-working centres in every town across the whole of Cornwall, so that people, including the council's 4,000 office-based staff, can all go and work in those local co-working centres. And now I have something called the evolution of the 3 minutes. The evolution of the location of work. So you start in your ad hoc workspace on your kitchen table, then you move up into perhaps a dedicated room, maybe a dedicated outbuilding. Maybe there's a village work hub, maybe there's a co-working hub nearby, and then you move upwards and onwards and up as if your business expands up into innovation centres and business parks and so on. In terms of the implications for new residential, as I said earlier, I think home working rates up to 2030, possibly 35 to 40%, given what we've seen quite recently. As I say before, things haven't really gone back down. Possibly in excess of 40% when we go up to 2050. So we need to ensure that new residential developments are what we might call home office friendly. We need to ensure there are formal and informal on-site co-working opportunities. So at the heart of any garden village development, I would certainly expect to see a pretty well-established co-working and with a well-managed, well-run and very popular local co-working centre. Increasingly, I think I might have said this before, but there is increasingly a trade-off between traditional workspace development and new residential development, which I think is really, really important. In terms of the implications for town centres, as I said before, hidden business parks, that picture that I showed you earlier, that pretty much, to me, that's a hidden business park right there. It doesn't say it on the sign, but for all intents and purposes, you've got 150 odd workers there. That's a hidden business park. There's a lot going on in that area. So it gives a new functional economic role to our town centres. It requires formal and informal local co-working settings, supports the highest levels of local economic development and growth. It's not currently recognised in economic statistics. So I'm going to speed up. There's some implications for transport, which you can imagine, but there has been a dramatic fall in commuting. I do believe that local transport planning needs to be reevaluated, as do local plans, quite simply. Here's a really interesting, really fascinating chart that goes back to 1861. So that's self-employment, the blue line, going back to 1861. Then the orange line is the home working rate, which only started being collected in 1981. However, what you can see is, you can see a 1990s telecommuting revolution in home working. I hope you can see that in about 1991. And what happened there was self-employment and home working suddenly aligned really, really closely for the first ever time. And then in 2023, then the pandemic came along, as we can see, and that's the next home working revolution. And in 2023, they still haven't gone back, and as far as I'm concerned, they're not going to. Matthew Taylor, who was at the first one of these sessions, I think. Matthew Taylor said, I won't read it out, but basically he said, I think the key words here is that instead communities should be welded back together as they once were, creating vibrant, mixed-use, integrated neighbourhoods and communities that create genuinely sustainable communities. And it was Matthew who inspired me to look at research to evidence what he meant by going back to the past. So I basically did a piece of research which ultimately looked at the 12,000 years that we've had here of continuous human history in this country, which showed that right up until the Industrial Revolution, that pretty much local communities of integrated, mixed-use craftspeople predominantly, even going right back to our Mesolithic hunter-gatherer forefathers, going through the Iron Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, the Roman period, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, right up to the Industrial Revolution, pretty much. And we were having a conversation earlier that it was the Iceni tribe, the British tribe that you had here. So those were your traditional home-working craftspeople back then. There was a bit of an argument whether or not they were here. And then the Industrial Revolution came along. That separated the home and the place of work. But with these two home working revolutions, we are seeing, in my belief, a return to the past, and that's certainly something that I think Matthew Taylor is quite keen on. And he inspired me then to write something which is called 12,000 Years of Home Working in the UK, from Mesolithic hunter-gatherer craftspeople to 21st century professionals and creatives. And I think, finishing here, finally, what I think is that the future of work in the UK will be at the heart of the sustainable development diagram here. And we can certainly do things which will help us get there quicker, which will help us get there more holistically, comprehensively, and far more integrated. And obviously, good, informed, and visionary planning is absolutely crucial to all of that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Great. Does anyone know, is it the Iceni? Did we get that right? Anyone know what the British tribe would have been before the Romans? We're going for Iceni. There's certainly an Iceni brewery, so.
Iceni, I've heard.
Sorry? Iceni. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Jim, can you join us?
How to pronounce it on the way, and I'm sure it was Iceni.
I'm quite happy to take it.
Shall we let's just do this. Brilliant, Jim, thank you. And if you can join the panel. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel to talk about the future of work. First of all, we've got Eva Woods, who is Peterborough's Youth MP. I think I've got the title right. Thank you for joining us. Then we've got Jim Newton, who's Director for Infrastructure and Environment at Peterborough City Council. And then Helen Clulow, Programme Director of Connecting Cambridgeshire, and obviously Jim at the end. So we're going to follow pretty much the same format. I'm going to throw a question or two at the panel. I'm going to invite you guys to be engaged and involved as well, and hopefully we can stir up a conversation. And I thought actually I might just slightly change of my plan here, because I was going to go to you first, Eva, but I'm going to spare you and go to Jim actually, because this Jim Plunkett-Cole's last point there was about planning really, and how much this impacts on planning. Now, one of the reasons for having these two workshops, Huntingdon and Peterborough, is because both authorities are going through a review of their local plan, looking at what their future looks like for the next 15 years. So how on earth do you factor all of that kind of information in, and that sort of revolution in the way we might be living and working, Jim? And how do we plan for that? I'd just be very interested to hear your views on how we structure a local plan when there is so much change going on.
Okay, thank you. That's a nice, easy question. Yes, how long have we got? Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I've been driving local plans for like 25 years, mostly around the Midlands. I worked for 10 years at Coventry City, driving local plans there and in Leicestershire and elsewhere. So I feel like I'm reasonably well qualified to try and answer that question.
Thank you.
I think it's a function of really complicated data that we need. So we start off with trying to understand the area, and so that's geography. What's our opportunities, bluntly? But also we need to have a very clear sense of direction, a very clear sense of what we want to achieve. Because the evidence gives us the backing for the policies which we prepare in our local plan, which has to be legally watertight. It's a very legalistic, very technical process to go through, but that's all pretty pointless if all we end up with is a document with some drawings of sites that we're going to allocate and some policies that says how we're going to determine planning applications. If there isn't an idea about how ambitious is the local area, what do we want to achieve, what supporting infrastructure do we need to achieve all of it. So flexibility comes into it a lot, but I think the most important thing is having the local leadership and vision that we can all align behind to a greater or lesser degree. People are always going to argue around the details, but actually I think the opportunity at Peterborough is that there is that clear sense of direction, there is that opportunity, there is the investment in both the planning service at the City Council that ultimately has to deliver this, but also the investment in the local area and the people who are going to deliver it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And I wondered perhaps if I could turn to you, Eva, and I'm kind of conscious that actually the first discussion as well about the future of skills and education is incredibly pertinent to our youth MP, and you have a panel as well that work with you, I think, don't you?
Yeah, I work closely with Peterborough Youth Council.
Yeah, exactly. So I wondered any reflections from you about what you've heard, perhaps particularly about that sort of sense of the future being perhaps home working or tri-bid working. Is that something that people on your panel, the people you're talking to, are contemplating, or is there more of a traditional view of work still within the sort of student force?
I think young people and students are definitely very open to new ways of working and are definitely considering those pathways. But I think what I see a lot with young people is they don't necessarily see work as this wonderful field of opportunities and innovation, but rather as something scary in an environment in which they've got to prove themselves. And I think young people, what we struggle with is trying to see ourselves as an asset in the future of work and evaluate whether a future working from home or working in a more traditional format is the right option for us, and more trying to mould ourselves and develop the skills to fit in with whatever employers want from us. And I would want to see a different approach from young people. I would want, whilst it's important to be keeping up to date with what employers want from us and what makes us desirable as workers of the future, I would want us to be better cultivating our own opinions about what we need if we are shifting towards a future more based around working from home. And also seeing that in Peterborough, because my role, as you'll see from my title, is entirely focused on Peterborough and our young community here. I represent 11 to 18-year-olds in decision making locally and nationally. And there is still this continued narrative of successes making out of Peterborough, really disappointingly. And I want us to be able to see our future here. And that comes from building a working environment that is a companion to the culture, and whilst working life and human life outside of that should go hand in hand rather than be seen as separate spheres, we do need to focus separately on building a package for the whole of life and life experience to go alongside that. Yeah. So I think young people are open to change, but I would want them to see themselves as being more at the centre of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Eva. Because I think that theme that's coming through from both those presentations and discussions is that huge change. When I'm sitting there kind of sort of almost quite anxious about it, it feels like a huge societal change that we're seeing over the next 15 years, and I guess we've all got to adjust to it. But one other thing that came through very much from both presentations, I thought, Helen, if I could turn to you, was that much of the future seems to be very much focused on connectivity and digitalisation, and that's very much what your role is at Connecting Cambridgeshire. Do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and then perhaps answer that question? I mean, is that right? Is that what the future's all about? And how do we predict the demand? How do we understand the technologies that we don't know about? It's the sort of, what are they, the unknown unknowns, is that right? What sort of connectivity will people need if we're going to be living that kind of life?
Firstly, we don't know what kind of connectivity we will need. It's changing every day. Like if you can think about, like we don't even have 5G yet. People are talking about 6G and the capabilities of 6G. So just for an introduction, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm the program director for Connecting Cambridgeshire, and my program sits within the Cambridgeshire County Council as one part of the place department that covers highways, transport, travel, economic development, growth, because it is a digital connectivity program but looks outwards for communities and businesses of Cambridgeshire. But I am also here with my program, which is funded by the Combined Authority. Therefore, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough communities and businesses are kind of my customers. And especially when I'm listening to all these facts in terms of working from home, future of work, future of learning, it all down to the infrastructure. Do we have the infrastructure in place? Do we have the broadband? I am sure all of us have those. Network is not good here at the moment, and I lost connection. So this is what my program delivers as part of one of the work streams, which is the infrastructure, mobile and the broadband connectivity. But in terms of future of work, where that infrastructure sits, it is also, there was a question came earlier about the retirement. Learning and Work Institute announced in recent research explained that 1.4 million people will be retiring in the next 13 years, then young people coming into the work life. So if we don't transform our lives with either artificial intelligence or some technology, we will definitely have a knock-on effect on our economy. So as a local authority, employee and looking after communities and businesses, I need to see that economic impact of these technology projects. And we're talking about 5G, as I mentioned, because understanding the background of 5G, it is not a speed, it is faster technology. It is all about the capabilities of what 5G can bring, for example. And it is not certain. We don't even know how much we can do with that 5G. This is why the other work stream, part of my program, is about pilots, undertaking those research projects to create those business cases for our businesses, for our own organizations. I am just hesitated to see if any businesses that really keen to try these technologies implement into their business plans, but they don't know what it means, and they cannot invest any money at the moment to something that they don't know, unknowns. Therefore, we are looking for those business cases that are available, or how I can reflect it into my own business. This is why I would definitely recommend working with the local authorities and talking to each other more, understanding what is available, how I can transform into my own business plan.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Perhaps if I can come back to Jim Newton. So planning must be very different, though. You talked about being involved in an awful lot of plans over the years, but given what Jim has said about, perhaps 45% of people, well, perhaps 30% of people, 35% of people working from home, does that mean we need to plan for less office space? Do we need to plan for more connectivity into the home? Do we need to plan for more co-working? How are we resolving those things? Has it changed dramatically? And Jacob, you're involved in planning as well, so if you've got a comment, I'd be interested in that as well.
I think that's where flexibility comes into the system. So local plans have to tread this fine line between being everything to everyone, but being really flexible for everyone as well. And so, of course, it's always going to be a balancing act. But I think there's some fundamental skills that can be put to good plans. So we need to understand what the geography is. We need to understand how markets work, how development works, and about risk, and about the implications of the tax system. So we don't have a tax system that encourages these kinds of developments. And in some cases, I would argue it actively discourages. So I referred to my time in Coventry, it was 10 years ago, and there was a development of commercial units at ground floor and then homes above them. Nobody wanted them because are you liable for business rates or council tax or both? And so those sorts of issues, we can't resolve them. We can keep raising them, but it's not in our gift to resolve them. The other point that I would make about development risk and markets is ambitious places, and Peterborough is an ambitious place, is what attracted me to come here. They understand that nothing happens if the public sector is just trying to dictate terms and trying to make everything happen for itself. We have to bring developers along board and investors as well as developers, because they're the people who are going to provide the money that makes these things happen, and they're going to be looking at risk. So the other thing that I've been doing at Peterborough City Council is to make sure that the planning department is sufficiently resourced, not only to deliver a local plan, but to determine all the planning applications, the procedural, processy, legalistic stuff that has to happen to bring these developments forward. Because the lower risk we are to investors, the more quickly the local economy gets turbocharged and we get these developments. The temptation for areas that like local authorities that need money is to have lots and lots of warehousing, because it comes forward, is really quick and easy to build, and it generates lots of business rates for local authorities. And there is a place for that. They generally provide mass employment, although I have my concerns about an AI droid warehouse in Northamptonshire that's just opened. But they generally should be generating mass employment, so they do have a place. But we have to get the balance right. We have to build in resilience, and that means flexibility of policies.
Flexibility indeed. Karl, I think you had a question, and then I'll come back to Jacob. Thank you.
I think Ross earlier said that a little bit of confrontational discussion may be in order, but I've got to pose a question. I've looked at some of the stuff, some of the work that's been done in this area about home working and productivity. If you look at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the UK has the worst productivity performance of the 38 OECD countries. And our performance is much worse since COVID. We've deteriorated the most. If you look at the Office for National Statistics, our output worker has fallen, and we're now 16.3% below the other G7 countries. And if we continue to lag behind, within 10 years we won't be in the G20, never mind the G7. Now, what and how do we think home working has been the main reason for that? And how do you reconcile the fact that 80% of employers say productivity has gone down massively since COVID and home working? 80% of employees say the opposite.
Okay. Well, that's certainly a great question I'm going to pose straight back to you, Jim Plunkett-Cole.
I'm glad you chose that, Jim.
Yeah, exactly. And I might come to you, Helen, as well on that in terms of productivity. What are your feelings about that? Is that a real trend that we're seeing? Home working is going up and productivity is going down?
It's a really great question, that's for sure. And it is the sort of question that I would generally go and do some research and get an answer to it. And I haven't done that for today. But I don't think... I have also intuition, I suppose. And my intuition would suggest that home working isn't the primary cause of that falling productivity. I'd be very surprised if it was. As someone who does analyse productivity statistics and different sectors, and at the local level all of the time, there are many different aspects which ultimately derive your level of productivity. I personally don't believe that home working is one of those, but I would be very happy to do the research that answered that question definitively.
Helen, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yes, and I would like to get the results of that, because I don't really want to believe that it's part of it as well, especially if we have the technology in place. But I think it is down to that creative thinking again you mentioned before. This is what needs to develop further with home working or future of work, because we talked about 5G and how we can deploy and use into our businesses reflecting our works. But I will just give an example of whoever invented the internal engine in a car didn't invent the ice cream mans. It is in the same way, whoever invented 5G is not the people will be creating those creative solutions for businesses to transform. So we will need both of them. So we will need those people home working and using that product skill, but also we will need some skills in place, these technical skills in place to invent those technologies and artificial intelligence or produce that together. So we need to have that balance of both sides, technology and which one is creating or supporting the productivity.
Excellent, thanks for that. I'm going to just turn now to Jacob, who's also from a planning background. Did you have any feelings about that? Has planning changed as a result of this?
Planning is changing in various ways. There is the AI, the technology impact, etc. But coming back to the land use planning point, which Jim was touching on earlier, we're going to need less employment land for big sheds because we're going to have less people working in those sheds and they're going to be more automated, and you're going to see a change now. More people work from home. So there's that. Which means we need to look at employment land allocations. I've specialised in that for many years, and I recognise Jim from previous things in the Midlands, so I'm pretty certain we've crossed paths in the past at some point. But the other bit that struck me around flexibility, which Jim was talking about, flexibility of space, flexibility of use, is I've been told repeatedly in central Birmingham, we still need new office buildings being built in central Birmingham, because that's what the occupiers want. And that is Second City, it's where the HQs are, it is your Goldman Sachs, HSBC, etc. They don't want secondary stock, they want the brand new, nice, shiny office, which means we have to build new offices. Yet we've got loads of secondary and tertiary stock when no one's occupying them. And part of the issue with that is that stock isn't flexible and agile enough to be converted into alternative uses easily. So when we are thinking about planning buildings, about planning places, about planning spaces, we need to think about the lifelong future of those buildings and think about how those buildings are going to evolve and change over time. And that comes back into the sort of climate change agenda as well, around reuse of materials, the thing about embodied carbon. So as a professional planner, when we're looking at policies and looking at designing places, we've got to be thinking about this is what we need today, but we also need to build in the flexibility. We don't know what the future is going to hold. It's a Donald Rumsfeld's unknowns quote that you mentioned earlier. But we know there will be change. So we need to plan in that flexibility, if that makes sense, to be less rigid.
No, thank you for that. It's very helpful. Could I invite Councillor Allen for I've got a question or a comment?
A question, really, and probably a comment. I'm certainly not a planner, but I am an interested party. And I think the question would be for Jim, who is directing our current new local plan. And I know it's a balancing act that you're going through, but would you say it's fair and reasonable that a local plan, a good local plan, would run out of employment land before its duration? Because presumably if the local plan that's put together still has availability at the end of its term, it would indicate that the economy is moribund. So how do you get it right, Jim? That's the question.
You don't. I think that's where the flexibility point comes in. But I mean, I've consistently argued during my time at Peterborough City that the fact that the employment land has been taken up so quickly that was allocated in the previous local plan shows that we allocated exactly the bang on the right sites, the most attractive sites that the market got away more quickly than we'd anticipated. Now that then leaves us with an issue where we now have we're relying on a criteria-based policy for speculative sites that come forward, but that's why we review the plan regularly. When planning has changed quite a lot since when I first started it, we would work out how much land we need, we'd allocate the land, and then we'd write policies that say, if you're not allocating on the land that we want you to, then the answer's no. Whereas now it's much more, we're facilitating, we're not managing. And we're probably not even planning in empirical terms. We're providing opportunities and we're setting a framework for speculative proposals to come forward alongside the sites that we are allocating. We're saying we definitely want these to be allocated, but we're doing our homework much earlier than we used to in the local planning process. So we're making sure that we're picking the winners from day one. So I'll come back to my opening remark on this. We picked the winners on the previous plan.
Very good. Thank you for that. Eva, if I could come back to you, one of the things that struck me, and I was struck by something that Mark Woods had said, was the danger that you might lose people from a profession which isn't flexible. So what I'm wondering about is, as you and your colleagues and the young people today look forward, are they going to be very much more attracted by flexible working rather than, I think Mark's point was, in a teaching world at the moment, it's not flexible. You have to come into it. You can't work from home. There isn't the flexibility that people want. Do you see that in your conversations, that people are looking for flexible lifestyles rather than 9 to 5 in an office at a desk?
I would credit young people for being very selfless in that sense, and I would flip back to what Ross has said earlier about sort of the social action and the ability to make a difference being at the centre of young people's ambitions in the working world. I think especially in terms of my colleagues, and obviously I associate a lot with a very particular type of person who is very outwardly orientated and wants to make a difference, the logistics of the job offer are secondary compared to the impact that young person can have in that role, and also the legacy they can be part of. Young people are particularly drawn to working with either very established companies or new and innovative ones because they want to be part of that journey. We want to contribute. But I would also say there is an emerging trend of young people who are, and we can't ignore this whilst it might be slightly dangerous to think about, who want to break away from this entire culture and see the working world as it stands as a very monolithic and oppressive entity, and this is fed by certain elements of pop culture. I won't name any particular names, but there are influencers currently who are encouraging young people to break away from all the practices we have at the moment, referring to it as the Matrix and things like that. I'd encourage you to look into that if it all sounds alien to you. But I think there is a growing proportion of young people who are very interested in breaking away from a traditional culture of working, but that is for selfish rather than selfless motivations. So I would say, without wanting to draw young people into a binary, because of course we're more complex than that, I would say we've got two clear groups emerging: those who are very selfless in their attitudes toward work and want to contribute and have that social impact, and those who are highly selfish and reject everything as it stands and see themselves as an individual rather than a contributor.
That's fascinating to hear, I think, and I was just thinking, it probably touches back to also that cohort of people who perhaps retired early, but actually there's so much work they could be doing. It'd be interesting to see whether they adopt the selfish attitude or the selfless attitude in where they spend their energies. And I wanted to come back, as we draw this session to a close, to Jim Plunkett-Cole. I mean, has any of what Eva's said, is that resonating with you? Is that something you're looking at the future of work as well?
Hearing that then was absolutely fascinating what you've said. You've been a breath of fresh air. Hearing some of those things, which I don't think I tried to keep us in touch. I'm 54 years old. I don't do a very good job of it, but I do try and keep in touch with young people and things. But what you were saying there about sort of two different cohorts, I think we can kind of see that. I think, and I do think, and when I finished sort of putting the diagram about sustainable development, and I said about the key characteristics of the future of work, it is inclusive. Part of its inclusivity, and that's what we saw during particularly during COVID, was that suddenly people were able to work from home, were being encouraged to work from home. It was very good for people who had disabilities. It was extremely good for women who needed greater flexibility. And I think equally for young people, it can give them the flexibility that they're looking for. But also, as I said previously, there are also a lot of young people out there who do meet their future partner, who do need the social aspects of a traditional workplace. So I think normally what happens is you have something over here and then you have something over here, and then what actually happens in the end is something that lands in the middle.
Brilliant. I'm going to sort of break my own golden rules of keeping to time, so I've got 3 people wanting to ask questions, and I think the conversation is really rich at the moment. So I don't know the other person's name, but Luke and the person next to you, can they be really quick questions if possible, and I'll farm them out? Sorry?
They're not linked at all, just a coincidence.
Okay, go for it.
I suppose. I wondered actually about the local plan process generally, about it lack of it's not a very visionary process. I think it generally is broken nationally, and I think it's a Peterborough issue, or Huntingdonshire issue. I think generally the way the local plans process works just doesn't work, and I wonder actually how, given the current structure of it, how it actually can respond to all the changing, figures. It can actually do that in the limited time and resources available to planning departments. And also trying to it's looking at 10-year timelines, which are just almost too long term now, which sounds a bit short term in some ways, but it almost needs to be updated more regularly.
Let me take that as one question. Yeah. Gentleman next to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I spend most of my time with those that are not in education, employment or training. So the 1 in 5 of us that drop out without any grades at all. So the point around selfishness for some young people that we work with, they're forced into selfishness as well sometimes, because they have to take that self-employment route because they can't succeed in life if they don't. But the point around the citizen-led stuff, so the community infrastructure, I'm just really fascinated about what you said, Jim, with the role that community infrastructure can take in our towns, in our cities, to replace the workplace benefits of having that community feel, so that sense of spirituality and community. And I'm just curious to understand what the future of that might look like from your point.
Final question from
Thanks.
the gentleman here quickly. Jim Newton, you're going to take the question on the local plan. Jim Plunkett-Cole, you're going to take the question on citizenship.
So a lot of it's been covered, but it's more of a practicality question. And my little secret is that I'm actually Peterborough born and bred, and unfortunately I was one of the ones that my goal was get out as soon as you can. Although the Met Lounge was amazing when I was young, I'm not sure I could go in there now. But anyway, that's the whole of the point. We're all going afterwards. Yeah,
you not got the invite.
So our business is a specialist in a lot of the future work that we're talking about, so the current future, smart technologies, modern methods of construction, and we also have more traditionally recognisable services, project management, cost management. And we are fully remote. We made the decision to be fully remote as a result of COVID. And as our team's growing, we're now finding, particularly Eva's points resonated with me, bringing in young people. And I remember back to being when I was young, and some of the best learning I had was being in an office and, let's be honest, being told off sometimes and being pushed in the right direction and shaped. And I just wonder whether that factors, and probably it's one for Eva, whether that factors into the debate. Like, do young people want to be in an office?
Right. Lovely.
To learn, in order to learn.
And that also perhaps goes back again to a comment earlier about learning about failure and learning about change. So very quickly, Jim Newton, local plan process is broken, we need to rethink it?
It depends on your approach. I think if you do what you've always done, then you're going to get what you always got. And I think that's what's different about Peterborough now, is that we're clear about what we want to achieve, and we're much more focused on the outcome that we want to achieve, rather than on the things that we want to prevent from achieving, or counting the exact right number of tractors and then allocating the right amount of space for all of those tractors. I think we're much more pragmatic about it, and think it right. So we want to grow the economy. We want to increase the tax base. We want to increase the flexibility of opportunities for people. We want to make it a better place that's going to attract and retain. Give the young people something to stay for. And that means a nighttime economy. That means all sorts of things. So we're much more focused on thinking about what it's going to be like if the plan is implemented, rather than sitting in a room on our own with our crayons and then emerging in a year's time and saying, "Ta-da, we did a thing. Do you like our thing?" And then you'll tell us whether you like it or not, and then we'll go away for another year, and then we'll go, "Hey, we changed our thing. Do you like the thing now?" That process that has to happen because it's a legalistic bit, but the outcome and the drive and the ambition and the sense of what we want it to be like, to experience it, I think that's what's new, and I think that's what's different about here.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. And other Jim Plunkett-Cole, on places, citizenship places, how does that work through, do you think, if we can translate that?
I'm not an expert, I'm not a sociologist or anything like that, but a few things that I can take. I live in a place called Frome in Somerset, and it's quite a progressive sort of place. And it does have quite an independent, it's progressive, it has a very good, strong sense of community. It also has 2 or 3 co-working centres, which for somewhere the size of Frome, which is 15,000 people, means that you have got a lot of local co-working opportunities. And the guy that ran the first co-working centre in Frome, he also set up the Frome Artisan Market, which is one of the most popular markets in the whole of certainly Somerset, if not the southwest. He had the creativity, the innovation to bring together four separate markets into one place, close down the centre of the town on the first Sunday of every month, and suddenly you're getting tourists and visitors coming in from all over the country. And that has helped to increase the productivity, going back to productivity, but it's helped to increase the productivity of quite a few of the local craftspeople who can suddenly sell their wares there. I think if you're spending more time where you work, then you want more local facilities. And I think that means you also want to live in, or because you're working there as well as living there, also you've got a great heightened sense, I believe, of social community and environmental responsibility. So with all of those sort of things combined, I think I'll be quiet.
No, that's brilliant. Perfect. Just conscious of time, and I just wanted Eva to come back on the point there about it's a bit binary, really. Do people want to be in an office or not? Do they see the advantages of that, or is the desire that more flexible workplace?
I think being in an office and being in that environment is absolutely invaluable to young people because it allows the opportunity for mentorship, it allows the ability to shadow. I will take any opportunity to shadow somebody in their work role because it's the way you learn about different, just the day-to-day running of things and things that aren't necessarily in the public eye. And also the more time spent with young people in an office environment on that human level, the easier it is to spot their skills and then be able to promote them on their journey throughout their career and to spot their interests and nurture that. And if I can come back super quickly on the comment about young people not in education, employment or training, because it relates to this, my role entirely is to represent young people's attitudes, but young people's attitudes should not be used as something to blame or as a mask for employers' lack of investment in young people's journeys through their careers. So that's my response to that one.
Yeah, and that is certainly going to be a constant. That's not like philosophers. That need is always going to be with us, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Another fascinating panel. Thank you indeed for your time. I must admit I've been absolutely fascinated by what we've heard so far, and I'd say that with no exaggeration. I just think the themes that are coming through and the sort of the trends in society are vast and require an awful lot of creative thinking. And I think some of the words that have been used around the importance of flexibility as we take this forward, and I think we were just saying what we had on the importance of recognising there is no one-size-fits-all solution to any of this is going to be crucial in our, and I use the small p, in our planning process, how we think and plan for the future. But some real tensions as well, I thought, in that sort of work-life balance about some of those professions that we simply won't allow that flexibility. So how do we recruit into those professions? And Mark's example, obviously, of the teaching profession, but there'll be other professions as well, where we're saying, well, no, I want my flexible lifestyle, and in order to do that, you can't have one. So that's going to create some real problems, I think, going down the track. So thank you to all our speakers for those first sessions. So we're coming towards the end, not just of this workshop, but of the 2 workshops. And in that first workshop, we looked at communities, we looked at how we design new developments, we looked at natural resources. So far today, we've looked at the world of employment, the world of education and learning. And we're going to finish by looking at the world particularly focused on energy and innovation. Because a lot of what we're talking about, and particularly if we're going to achieve those net zero ambitions, but also achieve the growth ambitions that I think everybody seems to be sort of united about recognising the need for that, and to provide the energy for a continually growing world population, as well as the domestic population, then how do we go about doing that? How do we create the energy sources to do that? So I'm delighted that I've got another great panel up with us today for this session. We've got Matt Hunt, who's a director at Royal HaskoningDHV. I've got Sam Luca from AESG, and Simon Evans, who's part of the Phoenix group. And perhaps when I ask you your question, you can just talk a little bit about yourself and your background when we do that. But I wanted to start really by turning to Simon and maybe just sort of saying, well, big question. How big is the problem? How big is the gap, the energy gap, if I can put it that way? Are we on the verge of a major breakdown in our infrastructure because we simply can't supply the clean energy that we need for the future? And we need huge technological breakthrough, or is it just about keep doing what we're doing, we'll get there? Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. My name's Simon Evans. I'm leading on the low carbon homes, low carbon neighbourhoods for Phoenix, but I've had 25 years in the energy sector, public side, private sector side, energy advice, policy, been on roofs with solar panels, you name it. Looking at the question, I almost took the question as what's the future of energy? And I think the future's already here. And I know some people have said we can't predict the future, but we can either create the future or realise that it's already here. 25 years in energy, you do read a lot of quite depressing stories. And all the stories about the heat wave. I tend to avoid some of the scientific papers because then you'll get into an existential funk about how bad it could be. So I kind of avoid that. But you can't avoid all the heatwave stories. So I thought I'd come along with 2 bits of optimism. So I think we could all do with a bit of optimism. There's a recent report from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and basically saying we are on track for net zero. So the targets to get to net zero, we're on track with the ambitious net zero scenarios by 2030. So the next lot of targets are almost here. Solar and battery costs have declined by 80% in the past 10 years. Wind, 73% down for offshore, 57% reduction for onshore. Fossil fuels will be in free fall by the end of the decade. So we're on track to deliver the targets that were set out in the COP27 summit last year, which I think is a pretty optimistic story, certainly a good counter to some of the awful news stories we're hearing. Then there was another one from Stanford University, which said 31 countries whose electricity generation is over 50% with wind, water, solar. So I thought that we're getting there. And those countries, there's 500 million people, at least, living in countries where they're getting 50% from renewable sources. So that's how I'm framing this question. So does the future already exist? Or the technology already exists, because we have the fundamentals, certainly at the communities and enterprise level of small scale, local. The grid scale stuff, perhaps long duration energy storage, sustainable aviation fuel and direct air capture, they need a little bit more work. But I think it's a question of scaling up deployment, scaling up the early stage technologies, deploying more of our current technologies, and the same can apply to people. We need more people to deliver it all. So it's there, but we need to do better. And we just have to take what Bill Gates said about optimism, which is optimism and hope are not the same thing. Hope is just the random hope that it will get better. There's no agency in hope. Optimism is the belief that you can do something about it to make it better. And I think it's the optimism to scale up the technology that is already here. That's how I'm reading the situation.
Okay, well, that is quite nice, encouraging news, particularly as you say, in light of sort of reading the very bleak news around climate change and its impact on southern and central Europe at the moment. Matt, in terms of your experience, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that, would you agree with that? Are you an optimist on this, or just hopeful?
No, I'm an optimist on this. I talk to my team a lot that if we rely on hope, then we're not going to get very far, because crossing your fingers is not really a corporate strategy. So I've got a background which overlaps with a number of people in the room. I started off working for Cambridgeshire County Council on Northstowe, which was mentioned earlier, looking at embedding sustainability in all of its forms within the early planning and delivery of Northstowe. But for the last 15 years, I've been at Royal HaskoningDHV, based in Peterborough, and I lead a team that work on effectively the planning and delivery of fairly large-scale national infrastructure. particularly focused in the energy sector and in the climate resilience world. My background, my training, my university education was in climate change, so the impacts of it, the causes of it, and what we can do about it. And I work very much in the application of that knowledge. The energy challenge that we've got is one driven, really stuck between two stools. We've got a huge demand increase, and we want to connect everybody. We want 5G, 6G, presumably next thing after that is 7G. I'm going to work on fairly simple extrapolation. As we all work from home, we all use Microsoft Teams. When we're sitting around at home in the evening, decompressing, everyone's on Facebook or they're on Snapchat, if you're my 13-year-old son, or whatever, all of which rely on huge energy-intensive data centres which are somewhere holding huge amounts of data but drawing a huge amount of energy. And on the flip side of that, we've got that something around 85% of all of the world's energy is produced by the consumption of fossil fuels at the moment. Now, there are definitely hotspots that go against that, but those two things create two challenges. We recognise climate change, we recognise the issues of it, and we recognise definitely the urgency of needing to do something about it. I would echo what Simon said. I think a lot of the technologies that we need to be able to resolve these issues are there. What we've got is an issue more in deployment rather than in, oh my God, how are we going to do this? For sure, there are lots of innovations that will come on, but we work at the moment in the deployment of offshore wind, for example. We're one of the leading consultants supporting offshore wind. That's a huge success story for the UK. Huge success story. We've got masses and masses of offshore wind development largely off the east coast, but increasingly off the west coast, off the coasts of Scotland as well, and come next year, starting off the coasts of Cornwall and Devon for those who live in the southwest. And that's been massive. Equally, there are challenges with delivering other types of renewables more locally, whether that's onshore wind, whether it's solar farms. There's quite a lot of pushback on this. And I think one of the challenges we've got with delivering on energy is matching up the desire that we have to tackle climate change with the desire that we, as residents, we as people in the room have, that energy is something that's developed over there, it's not developed right here. Thanks very much. And I think one of the challenges that we have, and it's one for planners, is to get to the point where people are much more accepting of the fact that they have to be part of the solution. Their environment, their local community has to be part of the solution, and move away from a massively centralised model, which we have at the moment. And recently, in the last few weeks, we've just got consents for Sizewell C nuclear power stations, 3.5 gigawatts of power. Hornsey 4 off the east coast, another 2.5 gigawatts of power, and a big plant in Lincolnshire, which is another 100 plus megawatts of power, all feeding electricity into the grid, but big schemes, big centralised schemes. And I was struck actually as I was thinking about this earlier, the comparison with centralised versus decentralised working. You know, we've spent the last 2 hours talking about moves away from centralising everybody in the office and now everybody working from home. I think, to not take over everything. I think one of the challenges that we have is how we deliver decentralised but value-generating energy.
Thanks, Matt. And well, let's put the same question to you, Sam. How are you on that scale of optimism, hope, or pessimism? Again, do you feel that we've got the tools in our armoury, we just need to deploy them better, or are there barriers to achieving those kind of net zero objectives?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So my name's Sam Luca. I am from a company called AESG. So we're a strategic and design sustainability consultancy, predominantly based in London, the southeast, but we do work across the UK as well. I think I'm broadly in kind of concurrence with my two colleagues here. The amount of work that needs to be done is mind-boggling in some ways, but I think we have the tools to do it. It requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of skills to be upskilled in order to get there. I think, as my two colleagues have alluded to, one of the issues is that the energy demand is increasing, as you mentioned, with the increase in electric devices, people using electricity during the day as they're working from home. We have that increase in demand, and whilst we have an increase in renewables, it seems like the increase in demand is increasing, and that renewable supply is trying to catch up, but it's not quite catching up. So I think there's certainly a piece in terms of demand management that is a very tricky piece, both kind of UK-wide and more locally and individually, really, in terms of reducing that demand completely, or reducing that demand as a whole, and reducing it during peak periods as well. One of the common criticisms of renewable energy is that it fluctuates. It's the wind. When it's windy, you have wind turbines that are generating. When it's sunny, solar panels are generating electricity. So there's a lot of work that I think needs to be done on an energy storage aspect to kind of balance that out, and in terms of reducing demand, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I think certainly the decarbonisation of the UK electricity grid is the biggest success story, I think, in terms of getting towards net zero. It's I think we're probably one of the best in Europe, apart from a few others, Sweden and others that have large hydroelectric dams, but we're, I think, one of the higher performers on that side. So yeah, optimistic, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Well, let me just pick up on that point of demand management. It's perhaps a question for all of us in many respects, because is that a barrier for us in terms of achieving these objectives? I mean, what we all seem to be, and I'm probably as guilty as anybody, is hoping that technology will save us. So let's buy an electric car, whereas actually the answer might be done by a car. Are we as a society, and this perhaps goes back into some of those bigger questions we were exploring earlier, and the points about, Ross, you talked about societal change, and Evie, you picked that up about employment choice. Are we actually making the right choices? Are the population coming with you on this demand management story? Who wants to try that one first? Sam, you look keen. Go for it.
I think so. I think there's, as Eva, I think, was noting, as well as Ross, in terms of kind of changing demands and changing what people value. I think there's certainly a consciousness to reduce energy and reduce our carbon footprint. There's many of you know that there's a lot of meters that you have in your house at the moment. You can have kind of split meters that have reduced cost during the night, for example, and an increase during the day to kind of flatten out demand management. It's a cheaper incentive to reduce demand, but we might see that kind of change so that you have meters, for example, that show when the carbon is the lowest in the grid, so you can use your electric devices when it's the most carbon, the lowest carbon footprint associated with turning on your washing machine or charging your car, for example. So yes, I think there's the technology, I think, is there, and I think the desire is there, and it's coming certainly from the younger generation in terms of driving that. But yeah, that's to be seen. But yeah, a lot of work that needs to be done, I think. Yeah. There. Yeah.
Matt, any thoughts on that one from where you sit?
I mean, I agree. It's definitely a complex issue. I mean, we're quite an aspirational society. We quite like new shiny toys. People like an electric car, but also we tell people that that's the right thing to do. And that's a very simple message. I think from an energy production and from a carbon emission perspective, it's not necessarily the wrong thing, if you like, to do. I think there is a need to move away from those very carbon intensive industries and those very carbon intensive uses of power, and moving towards electrification, where that electrification is powered by renewables, is a very positive move. It shouldn't be taken as an absolute, and it's probably you, Richard, who said earlier there's no silver bullets in any of this. There's no silver bullets in any of these problems. They're all massively complicated, and there's never a case where you can say just do that and everything will be fine. We do need to reduce the amount of power that we use. We do need to reduce the amount of non-electrical power that we use. We do need to move transportation towards electrification. So that's going to increase electricity demand rather than decrease it. So all of these things are interrelated. That doesn't make them impossible to deliver. It just actually means that the communication around them is a really key issue. One of the things I think that frustrates lots of people who work in the sustainability sector is it's so easy to get hold of a negative message. I think there's something, is it the Daily Mail maybe is running something this week, which is basically eviscerating electric cars. I think this is why electric cars aren't as green as you think they are. Well, electric cars aren't absolutely perfect. You don't plant a flower every time you put your foot down, but they are They are a very positive move in the round. But I think it's kind of community education, it's social education, and there's a challenge there for education about how you make sure that society understands some of these really complicated issues to the right level.
And Simon, talking about communities, obviously, we again go back to that context of what we're discussing here, the context of local plans and new communities being planned and new housing, much needed housing being built. How do we go about creating the energy? What's the innovation that we need to power those new communities?
I think it's innovation around the business model and innovation around how we manage the energy and how we stick it all together. We talked about flexibility, and I know you talked about education and workspace flexibility, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but flexibility seems to be a theme of today. How would you manage that energy on site? Well, you would store your surplus. So that's kind of being flexibility, using flexibility around the generation. And then you move the demand through the price signals or through nudging, through community engagement or through apps. So I think it's all there. It's just the innovation and the improvement around what you're deploying, not what you're actually deploying, it's how. Mm-hmm. And I think that's through software, through community engagement, through price signals, through just community engagement.
Yeah. So again, communication and getting the message across. I wanted to turn to Alex in the audience. Now, Alex, you run a renewable energy company. I mean, what are your experiences at the moment, and what are the opportunities and barriers to making this transition? Do you feel that the public's coming with you? Do you feel that market is there?
Thank you, Richard. I'm pleased to say I can also share the panel's optimism that we do have the technologies, they are available. I completely agree, it's about deployment, and you've hit various nails there, whether it's the planning system and the infrastructure, the incentives to do it, whether it's the economics for the investment in technologies, but also for me as a owner of a renewable energy business, there's a massive skills gap, which is quite ironic. We're sitting in a university. I cannot find engineers, staff, apprentices. They can't do the right courses at college. They can't, we've had an apprentice who can't join us this week because his college course isn't compatible with our business model. Yet, ironically enough, the marketing manager of the college was complimenting us on how well our engineers were training our other apprentices. And it's not joined up and it's not coherent enough. And I agree with Matthew completely. It's a big woolly monster. Yet here we are in Peterborough, which is the environment capital. We have aspirations to be innovative and developing. There's a lot of development going on. There's a lot of opportunities here. There's a lot of finance coming in. You've got the planners, the council, all the right people in the room. So if we can't make it happen, who can? And if we can't do it on a Peterborough scale, you've got to prove it here and then roll it out. So yes, I am optimistic. We have the technologies, but there are barriers to getting there as well.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you, Sam, in terms of your experience of where the market is at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I think an article I read the other day was about the connectivity, connecting large PV farms and other wind farms to the grid, and the wait time that they have because of the planning process and other barriers. And I think there was one that was given a quote of 2036 to connect.
I can beat that, 2037.
2037. So there's huge barriers, and that's obviously, those are paramount to us achieving our net zero goals. So I think that's perhaps where more kind of community renewable schemes can come into fruition, where you have partnerships between local communities and the private sector that are developing these solar farms, where you can supply renewable energy to the local community, which hopefully can kind of overcome some of the planning obstacles that you might have, and some of the I don't want to say NIMBY, but the people in the local community that might object to renewable energy because it being aesthetically not pleasing or an eyesore, for example. So I think there's definitely a lot of work that could be, and it's a very optimistic space in terms of community engagement and having communities running their own renewable farms to provide a benefit to the local community, reducing that connectivity time so it kind of feeds into the UK-wide net zero aspirations, as well as being providing local cheaper prices for local community as well.
The one thing I suppose I have been expecting to hear was perhaps that we're still waiting for the next big new technology, the next leap into hydrogen or something like that. Is that not the case? Where do you stand on that, Stuart? Sorry, yourself. Yeah. Oh, anybody. Sorry.
I'll come in on two things
Simon,
on that.
sorry,
I'm going to jump
yeah.
in now.
You go first.
I saw some wag on Energy Twitter this week saying your hydrogen strategy is 1, work out how much dirty hydrogen there is, 2, replace that with green hydrogen, 3, that's your hydrogen strategy. We do not need hydrogen for heating in homes because it's creating extra demand. Displace the dirty hydrogen first. And then in terms of is there a big technology around the corner, I would love it if somebody could work out how much money has been put into nuclear fusion. It's always 10 or 20 years away. Take that and then apply Swanson's law with solar, which is every increase in deployment, every doubling of capacity of employed solar, the price reduces 20%. Take that amount of money that's been wasted on nuclear fusion and say what would happen if we put that money into solar and the prices would come down even sooner. So I think fusion is a red herring. Green hydrogen for heating is a red herring. But green hydrogen is going to be useful. So I don't want anyone to think that in poo-pooing green hydrogen full stop, it's just not for homes. And it seems like some of the policy stuff is coming out to verify that. There was that hydrogen trial that's been, not quietly dropped, it's been dropped. And I think all the better. But hydrogen has a place, just displacing dirty hydrogen first and foremost.
Matthew, you want to go on?
I definitely agree hydrogen has a place. Hydrogen is on the lips of every large-scale energy developer at the moment. Partly because it is the future of energy transport. Partly, I think, because it takes away some of those issues that you've just mentioned. You can't get a grid connection until the mid-2030s. That's not very good for your economics. Your ROI goes through the roof. So the ability to do something contributory but different with the energy that's being generated by your wind farm, by your energy from waste plant, by your nuclear power station, is all to the good. And that does help then to decarbonise those hard to decarbonise sections of the economy. I think the other one, which is a technology that's being certainly touted as being quite significant, is small modular reactors and small scale nuclear power. Moving away from the likes of Sizewell, Horizon, Hinkley, all of which are multi-gigawatt developments, with all of the attendant carbon emissions for the creation of them, land take, draws on the grid, and so on, and being able to get them so that they're effectively, they look like a semi-detached house. Newer technology, that one's definitely at the earliest stage, needs to be tried and tested before I'll stand in front of a room full of people and say it's absolutely the future. But I think there is likely to be a significant role for that as part of, and again, no silver bullets, as part of a very diversified but low and zero carbon energy mix, which is what we need to be moving very quickly toward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Gentleman here again, please.
So I'm going to start my question with a caveat on this one. I'm by no means an expert. This is a curiosity, and hence as a panel here I'm going to ask. But something that seems to be emerging recently, linking to the work that we do in the modular space, is using a network of housing, so a development, as a power generation facility. I know Octopus Energy, for example, are doing some really interesting work in that field, so I just wanted to get your views on how that fits into this, considering the questions about sort of the localised level of community, etc.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's take another question, and we'll ask them both at the same time. Luke, at the back there, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I think we do a lot of work looking at retrofit and improving homes and getting them off-grid. There's a lot of appetite from people to take the home off-grid, or at least reduce their energy or heating demand in other ways. Often the problem we find is its cost. It's always the first thing that's cut on a project is the air source heat pump or the solar panels or geothermal, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, it's the thing people just can't afford. So I think there needs to be a really important sort of restructuring the way that can be funded. Because actually, we find every single project we work on, people want to do it, but they just can't afford it. Particularly in the current climate of rising construction prices and high inflation. It needs to really be looked at. I mean, conversely, equally as well, on the retrofit argument, it's also quite mad that retrofit is 20% VAT, and new builds are 0%. So perhaps that should be a way of should be looked at generally, is if flipping that over, or changing the way that the tax system works to incentivise different sorts of development, which would lead to less energy being used in the manufacture of new materials. We do a lot of work looking at that in the way specified products to try and minimise the downstream impact of a project in construction or energy use. So it's not just about the in-use, but also the way those materials are constructed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely. Sam, do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I'll comment on both or
yep.
Of them.
Please, thank you.
I'll comment on one. I'll leave the other to my colleagues. I'll comment on Jamie's question. In terms of the energy generating kind of groups of homes or communities, that's absolutely possible. For new houses in particular that are built to passive house standards, you can have very minimal energy demand, and you can have PV on the roof that will end up being a net exporter of electricity to the grid. So in that sense, absolutely. I wasn't sure if you meant that or on a kind of flip scale, some of the heat networks that we now are seeing, 5th generation heat networks, where you have interconnected pipes effectively between the buildings. And this is even more prevalent when you have a mixed use development where you have cooling and heating at the same time, simultaneously dumping heat into the network that then can be used for heating or hot water in a home, and then they can dump the cool energy into the pipes that then can be used for the cooling in the office spaces. So yeah, I think there's absolutely a lot of potential and opportunity there. I think it needs to be better regulated in terms of, I know Scotland are regulating more kind of passive house levels of fabric, and I think that's what we're going towards with the Future Home Standard, but it should have been a bit earlier in my opinion. But yeah, there's certainly loads that can be done there.
And Simon, what about the point that Luke raised about retrofit? I mean, that sounds a bit of an anomaly.
Yes, I mean, I would 100% agree with the VAT correction. I would agree that it's ludicrous that there is not more attention paid to retrofitting the 26 million homes already in existence. Choose your numbers, 20 million plus. Because they're already built. We really need to do something about that. And having done 15 to 20 years in retrofit, it's really hard. It's really hard and really difficult. So anyone who's still doing retrofit, and there's lots of people still doing it, I have utmost respect for people who are still doing it. There's the Retrofit Academy, which is training up installers and people to do the work. So I think it's a lot of local street level approach. So again, we know how to do it. It's how we finance it, and that's when I kind of fall down a little bit, because not having done retrofit for a good few years now, there are probably some people working on exactly that. But I will concur. It's 20, or perhaps not. Perhaps we'll speak later. It's still not. Yeah, we should be voting on that just as much, if not more, than the new build housing.
Thank you. And Matt, perhaps a final remark from you, and then we're going to bring this panel to a close. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So finance is a massive issue, and finance and particularly return on investment and how you shape that return underpins most of the things that we're talking about. In the large scale infrastructure, it's about corporate risk. I think Jim mentioned risk earlier. It's about whether companies are prepared to put money up at risk, bearing in mind if you're a large energy producer at the moment, your profits are quite eye-watering. So it is just deferring you making your money rather than whether or not you're going to make your money. On the domestic side, it's not my area, so this is just a personal observation, but I remember when I was probably working for the county council 20 years ago, somebody said nobody ever looks at what the ROI is on the 30 grand kitchen that they're just about to put in their house, or whether or not they should take out a lease on a Range Rover or on a Ford Fiesta. And what people choose and don't choose to apply return on investment to is quite an interesting one from a societal point of view, and probably goes back to the points on societal education about where value really lies and what you should and shouldn't be choosing to put your money into, I guess.
And maybe that's a very, very good place to pause, because that's a great reflection in a way, but where do you put your money, and where do you invest, and where do you seek return on investment, and where do you see it's just actually doing the right thing? What I wanted to do is just bring that panel to a close. I'm going to ask the panel to stay where they are. Give them a round of applause, if that's okay. And just quickly, because we're getting close to our finishing time, and I want to spend a bit of time talking to Karl about his thoughts on all of this. The sort of final thing we wanted to do was just sort of invite you to reflect a little bit on what you've heard and consider, what is it that we've been discussing today that we need to sort of extract and apply? What are the principles that we're going to need to apply as we go forward? We've got this planning process, which is, yes, it's written into the local plan. There's the legalistic local plan that we've discussed, but there is also general planning, all of us, in actual fact, planning for our own lives, whether we buy that kitchen, whether we retire at 60, whether we decide to go into the workspace or not. What are the principles that we need to adopt if we're going to make that transition? Because it does feel to me like a tremendous, almost a revolution, a societal revolution as well as a technological revolution. And I wonder whether anyone's got any reflections on what they've heard, any sort of final thoughts, or indeed any principles that they feel we should be applying as we take this forward in our own sphere or more collaboratively. There's a big question. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just a big believer in making, if it's not industry's problem, it's not government's problem, it's not education's problem, you need to make it a community issue. So I think there's a language, but especially around these sort of conversations, you almost have a bit of a fear to even put your hand up, because like ESG, we spend so much time talking about the E, and there's not enough time on the S, because someone said earlier it's really hard to measure it. So I think from just listening today, which has been fascinating, so thank you for having us. But I think, how can we go away today and make this more of a community issue? How do we have these conversations within our communities and enable people to do things for themselves? Because then we don't have to rely on these amazing rooms of very clever people, and we can bring the change back to us as a citizen level.
Yeah, really helpful. Nigel, is that you waving? Looks like you are.
Sort of, yes.
Excellent. I wasn't sure.
No. Gesticulating, I think, is the word, Richard. So on a similar theme, the word I didn't hear this afternoon until just now was citizenship. Mm-hmm. Maybe because it's an old word, or there's a new word. But I'd correlate that to what Ross was saying at the beginning about curating knowledge and how to make sure people have the agility to curate that knowledge in a sensible, meaningful, impactful way. Whether we go back to the office or not, who knows? I'm somewhere in between at the moment. But I'd like to think there's a massive opportunity in front of us about more time spent locally and getting back into curating local spaces. So if you're invested in the place you live, in a literal sense, because you bought it and you want to improve it, how do you invest in the street that you live on, the people next door, the wider society in that place? And I think that's what I'm trying to grasp at in terms of how do we build future good places. So we're talking about good growth or good design, but actually what's good society in the way that these places work, and how do we create that knowledge and joint ambition to make our local places the best they can be, because power starts at home. So the big solutions are somewhere else.
Very connected sort of citizenship, community. Max, you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, thanks Richard. My name's Max Farrell. Is that working? Oh, there we go. The chief exec of an organisation called the LDN Collective, and we are involved in a lot of master planning, so ranging from urban regeneration schemes to new settlements, including for clients like Phoenix Group. And one of the things that struck me today is the need for the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. We heard earlier on in terms of educational institutions working more closely with employers. And I think in this sort of topic, we've heard a lot about, and in one of the last panels, about the need for planning policy to create the right framework and work more closely with developers and house builders rather than having an adversarial approach. And I think that is very true. And I think things like, the difference between urban regeneration and new settlements, there are big differences, and there are, we've heard about the complexities of retrofit and the VAT issue. We did a government review of built environment policy about 10 years ago, the Farrell review, and we recommended then that VAT should be exempt on retrofit. We were told flatly that was never going to happen because the Exchequer they have a track record of not sort of taking away revenue streams, basically, and it is quite a fundamental sort of point. But equally, how are we going to achieve our net zero targets and so on? So for me, I think collaboration has been a really important theme, and sort of also the flexibility and choice. I thought just one final thing that was really interesting was that comparison between decentralisation of people going from offices to home working and decentralisation of energy from larger power stations to community heat district.
Absolutely brilliant there, Max, is maintaining the alliteration, because we had community first, then we had citizenship, and then you went straight in at collaboration. And then I thought, how is he going to manage flexibility? But you went for choice, which is superb.
So you've got all the C's.
And then you went for centralisation stroke decentralisation. So anybody else who wants to speak,
it has to begin
you
with.
have to make sure it begins with C. Otherwise, Jacob, here we go, he's taken the challenge.
So, exactly on that point, capacity. We've been talking about capacity in terms of energy capacity, in terms of educational skills capacity, grid capacity, but also local authority and public sector capacity, which is lacking massively currently. And that comes on to collaboration, because planning systems often seems a barrier. Actually, we have a discretionary planning system that allows us to do whatever we want if it's a material consideration justifies it. So you don't have to comply with the plan and comply with another C for you. But to do that, that needs local authorities to be properly resourced, so they have the capacity to be actually able to work with developers. So we get away from the adversarial approach. And that's probably enough C's from me, but thank you, Richard.
Fabulous. Yes, go ahead, Matt. Yep.
I'm really pleased you made that point. As I look back at some of the planning authorities that were a bit more groundbreaking in these areas 20 years ago, they were the ones that were prepared to do both those things. Challenge the legal expectations on them and say, okay, we're doing this for the right reason. We can prove we're doing this for the right reason. And that's about having appetite, but it also does come down to collaboration. And lots of those were done by engagement with elements of the private sector, and using those elements of the private sector to then lead the communities, lead the rest of the sector with them. I think we saw earlier the sustainable development three bubbles, which is a classic if you're in our line of work, and goes back to a classic report. But one of the things which I think gets lost in the discussion is that you're looking for the optimal trade-off between those three different things, and you're looking for the optimization of each of those things. And it's about how you can use planning, how you can use development, how you can use retrofit to ensure that your communities thrive, that your biodiversity thrives, that you're producing power to enable all of those desires and requirements of that society to be achieved without anyone feeling that they've got the short end of the stick. That's the really difficult bit. It sounds very motherhood and apple pie as I say it, but that really focusing on thriving, focusing on what the opportunities are in every situation, that's where we need to make sure that we're putting our energy.
Thank you. I've got one final comment from Luke at the back, and then I'm going to invite Karl to join us at the front here. Okay, thank you.
I had some more C's.
Excellent. What you got?
So compassion and care, I think, is quite important coming through the conversations from this and the previous session. I mean, I was quite struck by Eva's point earlier about success for used to mean leaving, or maybe still means leaving Peterborough. And as someone who came back to Peterborough to try and bring some success to Peterborough, I think what these two sessions show is there are communities, Alex's point, within Huntingdonshire and Peterborough who do care about the place and want to invest in those communities, but actually sometimes the stumbling blocks are larger organisations and businesses and councils who aren't willing to invest or able to invest in building those relationships to bring forward positive change to those communities. But I think the positive note is actually there are lots of people in these rooms who do care and want to bring forward that positive change. Brilliant. So it's just enabling that.
Great place to finish. So thank you all very much indeed for that contribution. And lots to think about. And I think it'd be a great time now to invite Karl to come and join us and just perhaps offer a few of his thoughts. Do you want to take the mic here, Karl? Thank you very much. And I thought perhaps we could just start, Karl, for those who aren't aware, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about Phoenix Sustainable Investments and what it is and your ambitions for the organisation.
I think those people who know me, I've been developing, I suppose, communities, housing, commercial for a long time in this area, probably for 30 years. I sold my housing business, but I still have various interests in it, to actually move into something I've always been I've always tried to push the boundaries of sustainability, and I've tried every product, and people who know me know that probably is not a lot I haven't tried in moving to passive house and all the different Green Deal house, things like that. So I'm now looking at renewables, jobs and energy parks, and really kind of still have some housing interest, but maybe I look at it from a different way now, because I'm thinking actually renewables is the future, and frankly that will be for the future. And what I've done in the last couple of years, I've kind of built up a portfolio of micro wind. I've obviously I've always been an expert in solar, because I've built probably more solar than probably any other developer in the UK in various times. I'm working on a solar steam project out in Kenya, producing steam. I'm involved in biofuels now as part of the mix that may involve energy, and it might involve hydrogen, but clearly biofuels is an intermediary stop. I'm involved in waste to energy, dealing with kind of clinical and hazardous waste. I'm involved in a business that deals with retrofit solutions and supporting them to try and deal with what is a really difficult problem, as Simon said, and actually trying to make that easier in a very difficult situation. And I've got a flood risk house that I kind of worked on, looking at maybe climate change and where that might lead to, and then obviously involved in batteries and EV cars. So a lot of that can then be brought together in many ways. So I'm looking at integrating a lot of those technologies to actually look at how we can be looking at communities of the future, whether that be communities generating energy locally or whether it be communities developing jobs. And it would be great to be able to get the skills in this area to allow us to be able to do some of these things, because getting on the sea, the challenges are immense for innovation. They are really, really, so it's harder to do anything because you've got the banks very cautious, so they won't lend anything unless it's absolutely certain. You've got people like the RICS who don't value anything that's sustainable. So that's kind of a government feature, so that's a problem. You've got all of the regulatory bodies like NHBC that really are cautious, and so they don't encompass the new technologies very well. So we've got those challenges. Now, they're clearly not insurmountable, but they make it difficult. And then we've got things like, we all know about air source heat pumps, but I can tell you now, I know people who have done air source heat pumps. There's about 200 parts in an air source heat pump. And we have not got any engineers in the UK that can deal with those problems. So I've got people who've got air source heat pumps, and they are just hoping that the bits that go wrong are not the bits that they have to go to Germany to get engineers to fix. And I can tell you now, there are people around the country who are having to go, when those bits go wrong, and we've got no skills in the whole of the UK. If they go wrong, then you've got to go you've got to go to Germany and buy another one, because that's the only solution you've got, because we haven't got any resources and engineers in the UK. So on something that everyone is aspiring to, someone like me would be thinking, Christ almighty, if I had a site full of air source heat pumps and the point went wrong, we got no one in the UK to fix it. So big risk. So I'm probably sort of looking at the So I'm a sort of always a half full. I think we've got lots and lots of great things, and I'm dealing with that. But we've got to think about the challenges, and I think there's a lot of things that other people need to do as well within the university skills, and then looking at the de-risking point of view, because there's a lot to do.
Yeah. What about your reflections on today's event, Karl? What have you heard that's inspired you, or made you anxious, created worry?
I mean, what's great about seeing a lot of people here is you've got people like Ross, you've got who are obviously clearly wanting to get tomorrow's kind of people to be able to deliver some of the solutions. I'm passionate about education, as people know me are, but I'm also passionate about practical skills, because I think we've moved away from that, and therefore the UK needs to have a lot more engineers and a lot more technical people, especially in this area, if we're going to try and embrace some of these technologies that I'm talking about, which can come to this area, and they're high value jobs, so that's got to be good news. I think looking at the flexibility of plans that Jim mentioned, I mean, that's important, because this is going to be a majorly changing world for the next 10 years. So we're going to have to cope with many, many innovative things that are going to come through that are going to be challenging. And so that's kind of, it's refreshing to see that there's obviously, areas of the political agenda where people object to probably almost anything. So that's kind of a challenge, because I've had to deal with that most of my life. People are objecting to, and frankly, it's trying to have the strength of people who are having to make these decisions, not to be scared to make the right calls, even if it's sometimes unpopular, politically or otherwise. Now, I know how difficult that is. I've never really believed that energy policy should not be national and taken away from the local and the political agenda, because I think energy policy is too important to be dealt with by local people who want to block everything. So I think it should be taken out of that, but that's just a personal view. Looking at things like Green Deal, that was brilliant, but it never worked. But trying to help retrofit, get built, because really, no disrespect, the carbon footprint, I mean, we can keep changing on new houses, but it's absolutely minuscule. The old houses and the old stock, I mean, it's 20 times higher, the CO2 emissions. So frankly, why we're not concentrating on the old stock, because that would just solve it overnight. And that's why things like the Green Deal that never took place, but funding for those, I think should be absolutely top of the agenda. But politically, it's not popular, so no one pushes it, government or anything, but it has to be dealt with, because that's where most of our CO2 issues are. So there's kind of things like that. So reflecting on the things today, I think there's a lot of good people. There's a lot of things we can all do, but there's everyone's got to work together, and we've got to kind of try and find solutions to the skills and all the other stuff. And one thing that always kind of I reflect, when I was climbing the Alps last year with one of my sons, and it really, really is incredible if you climb up the Mer de Glace, if any of you know that. Now, the Mer de Glace kind of goes up to the top of Mont Blanc, pretty much, near Chamonix. And as I'm walking along there, that the glacier was losing, just in the month of June, and it lost 3.5 meters of it, and that is equivalent to 10 centimeters a day. Now, that if any of you ever go out there, and you've been there 10 years ago, you could see it's absolutely been destroyed. Now, climate change is causing that, some of it, not all of it. And so, when you go there, most of us in this country, we kind of think, oh, well, that's not too bad because it's a bit warmer, and so that's good for the country. But when you see what it's doing globally, then you start worrying, because you can't help but, if you go to the mountains like I have to do, and you love the mountains, and you kind of go there and you climb in them, and you start seeing all these problems, you think, cracky, and all these heat waves, and when they're not normal, are they? So we've got to embrace all this stuff, because there won't be a generation in the future if we don't. So we've got to try. And so I'm really pleased with the panel who said that all three of them said that they were confident that we can make a difference. So that's brilliant, but it's easy saying it, doing it is much more difficult.
And if there was one of those C words, I'll be careful how I use this expression, those principles that we came up with: citizenship, community, collaboration, choice, centralised capacity, compassion and care, any of those particularly resonate for you in terms of how we take things forward?
I think the one that everyone has to kind of embrace is collaboration, because I don't think anyone around in this room can make a massive difference, but together we can make a lot. So that's government, that's local authority, that's the planning department, that's the university. I mean, that's every one of us here can make things work, and things can work if people want to make them work. It's very easy to stop things. It's much harder to make them happen. So collaboration, in my view, is everything. We've got a big issue. We've got a great opportunity in this area with some of these kind of technologies, some of which need a bit more work. Some of them are difficult. Some of them need a lot of skills. But actually, we've got a fantastic. So collaborating with the combined authority, the local authority, getting money into the area, which the council have done a brilliant job on, and trying to embrace some of this, because if we can get these kind of technologies in, that will keep the people from the university who come out, they'll keep them in the local area because they've got higher value paid jobs, they've got lots and lots of things they can do. So I think to some extent we are in a brilliant area if we can take advantage of it. And I think, you know, the new university and trying to keep the people locally here, because you need to keep skills locally, and that's what is important. And I think we can, you know, do so. Collaboration is my buzzword, really.
Brilliant. Karl, it's 7 o'clock, so one of my jobs is to finish on time. Just wondering, is there anything else you want to say? Are you happy to?
No, I just would like to say thank you for everyone for coming. Hopefully it's been a good conference. Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the rest of everyone for being here. And I think there's been some really good debate. So thank you very much for everyone for being part of that.
Thank you, Karl.